Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto became the god of dragons? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Throat of the World. The wind in the land of wind didn't just blow. It scraped. It got into the seams of your clothes and under your tongue, tasted like old glass and sunburn. Naruto adjusted the scarf at his throat and kept the car moving along the ridge before the dunes slipped again. To the south, the ruins of Roran lay like bones on a beach, broken spires and glassy ribs thrusting up from the sand where an ancient city had drowned under time. 2 dunes ahead, the crest is hollow, Hinata said softly beside him. She didn't raise her voice against the hiss and rasp of the storm, she didn't have to. He would have heard her if she'd only breathed it. There's a current under it, like a river that forgot it wasn't water. He grinned without looking away from the dune line. We'll not be the ones to remind it. Hold the wagons, I'll check the belly. He didn't call commands so much as he set them down like stones on a path. Clones blurred into being at his shoulders, 4, then 6, then a fanned-out dozen that slid down the dune like skiers and went orange in the dust. The surveyors, 4 scholars in wrapped hats with notebooks and an optimism only academics could survive on, huddled in the lee of the first wagon. One of them, a boy younger than Naruto had expected for this kind of trip, held the lead rope of a donkey and watched the clones with open envy. You're safe, Naruto told the boy as he passed, Bako. Say he could feel the question wanting to be asked. Promise. The boy nodded hard and swallowed whatever he'd meant to say. Hinata's hand brushed his sleeve, a small anchor in the moving sand. There are people under there. Old chambers. And veins, she added, eyes widening with the Byakugan's bloom. Not just tunnels. Lines of chakra. The way lightning is a line before it's a flash. Good eyes, he said, which was almost a joke. And she almost smiled. He slid down the slope to the hollow, the sand giving way under him in a hush like someone breathing in. The clones spread, testing the ground with shared instincts. One threw a weighted line to another, and they made a loose human chain over the unstable bit. Another clone knelt, hands flattened, listening not with ears but with the bottoms of his palms. Naruto felt it then, faint as the itch before a storm, a pulse. He'd felt similar under Konoha near the old hot spring runs, the pressurized rumble before a vent coughed steam, but this was, listening back. A shift in pressure, an expectant hush, as if the sand itself had leaned closer to hear what he would say. He didn't say anything. He knew enough to let sleeping dragons lie, and when he didn't yet know there was a dragon. He waved the real caravan off that line with a quick gesture and a click of his tongue. The wagons creaked, the scholars muttered about stratigraphy and dating, and one of the Suna Chunin escorting them, a woman with sun-bleached hair and a face like a coil spring, flicked him a grateful nod. He returned it. This was her sand, even if it wasn't her storm. They made the ridge and turned toward the broken arch that marked Roran's edge. The wind died as if someone damped a switch. Naruto's skin prickled. Hinata's eyes widened again. Not for show, he fell. The same thing she did an instant later. Silence in the desert is wrong. It means something is holding its breath. Down, he said, and the word hit the air before he realized he'd used a tone that made people heed him even if they weren't listening. The first mine went off where the boy had been standing, if Naruto hadn't grabbed the back of his coat and flattened him behind the wheel. It wasn't fire. It was a hush that smacked. A low thump that chewed up breath and replaced it with lead. His clones guttered like candles in a draft, 6 of them popping into smoke that the still air didn't even bother to stir. Chakra suppressant, Hinata rasped. Even her voice sounded damped, as if the sound had weight and the weight had been stolen. Not standard Suna tech. White mantle, said the Suna Chunin with the spring coil face. She didn't spit. She looked like the kind of person who hadn't wasted spit in a decade. Foreign masks playing god-catcher in a godless land. Naruto's grin went out like a match. He didn't waste breath on an answer. Breath had texture here, and someone else owned it. He signed with his hands, old Anbu shorthand he'd been taught and had almost never used after tea. He wore, pointing Hinata to the high left ridge, Chunin to the right, himself down the middle toward the source. He lifted his palm to the scholars, a flat stay. The boy was shaking under his hand. Naruto put the boy's hand on the donkey halter and closed his fingers around it. "Hold this," he said. "It will do better if it thinks someone brave has it." The boy swallowed twice and nodded. I'm brave. Yeah, Naruto said, and pushed up before they both had to prove exactly how brave. The first squad showed when they thought he would flinch, white lacquer masks bobbing up over the ridge. Cloaks that didn't flap in the non-existent wind. Their spears hummed with seals inscribed down the haft like teeth. Naruto didn't know their work, but he knew design when he saw it. Long, narrow, not meant to kill with penetration but to impose a will along a line. "Target set," a voice said, calm and close to detached. They weren't yelling. The odd hush carried the words like a wire. "All units, maintain muffling field. Vocal signatures prioritized." Vocal what? Naruto had enough time for the half-thought before three of them slid down the dune with practiced grace. No sliding, really, the sand took them like water took fish. He didn't meet them with chakra. The air was treacle, fine. He met them with boots and sand and an awful lot of momentum. He let the first spear glance off his forearm guard and hooked his elbow around it. Twist kicking the second in the knee. The third lunged for his throat, which told him something about their briefings. He let it pass and pushed in so close he could smell iron on the man's breath and cracked his head into the mask. It split like an egg. The man swore and dropped the spear. It sang when it hit. Naruto kicked it into the dune and it went down, 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 humming. Like a note swallowed by an instrument. A clone that had survived the suppressant field by sheer stubbornness hit another mantle in the back with a shoulder tackle that would have embarrassed a boar. Naruto didn't have time to appreciate it. He found himself looking at something that had not been on the dune 2 breaths ago. It looked like an obelisk. It had been a pillar once, part of an arch maybe. And now it had been coaxed up through the sand by a charge under it and was tipping along its long axis toward the wagons, toward the boy and the donkey and the scholars who had flattened themselves into the shape of fear. "Hinata," he shouted on instinct, and the dead air stole the volume but not the urgency. "I know," she said in that same breath, and he knew she did. Her glance was already measuring angles and velocities like she'd been born with a slide rule behind her eyes. Her fingers flicked and hit 2 chakra points on the lead Shunen's shoulder, heightening the blood flow to the legs to make a sprint possible in this heavy air. She didn't waste time on any technique the field might muffle. Naruto didn't calculate. He ran. He hit the obelisk with his shoulder, because that was what he had. And because sometimes you drove a stake where you wanted the world to hold. The slab was heavier than the kind of thing you talked to. It was heavier than apologies and quicker than regret. It drove him at the knees and made a wet sound in his back that would have been a groan if he'd let it. He didn't. Somewhere in the battered corners of his mind a little voice sighed. This is stupid and brave and you don't have enough hands, and an older voice said you've never had enough hands, so make more. 3 clones snapped into being under the edge of the slab. They didn't have breath to shout in triumph when it slowed. They had breath to shove. Sand hissed and took some of the load. The boy and the donkey moved because Hinata's hand closed on the back of the boy's collar like a mother cat. The obelisk kissed the wheel where the boy had been and slid by, a finger breadth of space between stone and life, then drove into the next dune and stood there with the insult of a flag planted by an enemy army. Naruto let the pressure take him to his knees, and if the world tilted that was between him and the sky. He laughed. It was not a sane laugh, but it made the boy's eyes ease a fraction. And sometimes that was the difference between panic and motion. "You're heavier than you look," he told the slab under his breath, then pushed to his feet because there were still masked men and insurgent physics and a caravan that needed moving. The Suna Chunin with the spring coil face. Her name was Sayaka, he realized now, because Hinata had used it in a prayer under her Br. Eth. Made a sound between admiration and get on with it. "You take hits like they owe you money," she said, then jerked her chin toward the old arch. "We can make the interior chambers. The wind won't help them there." "It's not wind," Hinata said. "It's something sitting on the air." "Yeah, well," Sayaka said. "Let's make it stand somewhere else." They made for the arch. The mantle harried them He weighed professionals' hairy prey. Not too close, not too far, features undefined by their masks, movements smooth and economy class deadly. Naruto met them with decoys and obstacles, and, when it mattered, with a kind of stillness that wasn't in his body but in his decisions. He put clones where you would shoot if you were deciding from a rooftop with a map. He put himself where the line would bend if you were tracing it with a ruler you thought was absolutely straight. Inside the arch the world changed. The hush folded itself tight and then released, like a hand unclenching. It wasn't gone. Ad simply picked a different kind of pressure. The ruined hull caught the hush and fed it back in echoes that weren't echoes so much as remembered sounds trying on new bodies. The walls were pale glass that had slumped and cooled and been broken and then sanded by 1,000 years of weather until they looked like river stones that had somehow stood up. Scouts, Naruto signed, and 2 clones curved into the side corridors on the right and left. He took the central path with Hinata and Sayaka and the scholars and the boy and the donkey, because leadership meant you went where the slowest had to go. The veins are closer, Hinata said, eyes still open to a world few people got to see. They're under the floor. Naruto didn't feel it as lines. He felt it as an anticipation, a breath about to be drawn. He didn't know he was rubbing his throat until Hinata's fingertips brushed his wrist, a question and a warning, both gentle. You're doing well, she said without ceremony. You're biased, he said. I am, she said. And then she smiled in that small way she had that could kick the legs out from under the worst kind of fear. That doesn't make me wrong. The hall opened into a cavern that didn't look possible. The ceiling had broken and slumped inward a millennium ago, glass hung in translucent curtains, ripples frozen from where it had tried to keep moving after the heat had fled. At the cavern's heart, in a depression like a giant thumbprint, lay a pool of glass that wasn't quite solid. It wasn't liquid, either. It was slow. All around the edges of the depression, old machinery stuck up, pylons, rings. The suggestion of a lattice that had once harnessed something not sane. The white mantle were already there. They moved with the confidence of people who had walked this story more than once. Priming charge set, someone said near the pool, and the words came to Naruto with the now familiar ease of messages on wires. Confirm field integrity. Integrity at 78, another voice said. Suppression level 5. Vocal target unconfirmed. Vocal target. Naruto's teeth set. He didn't know what they wanted him to be, but he could guess the shape of it by the way they aimed. We move, he said. He didn't shout. The word landed in Hinata, in Sayaka, in the Chunin who had been pretending he wasn't shaken, in the boy who had tied the donkey to his wrist like trust. It wasn't magic, it was clarity, and sometimes clarity was enough. They moved. Naruto took the right flank, because it was longer. Hinata slid left, because the pillars had gaps a Byakugan could thread. Sayaka and the Chunin held center, shields up in a line that made an old woman scholar tuck herself behind them without losing her dignity. Clones threw smoke that didn't have to travel far to confuse masked men who refused to breathe like people. A mantle with a spear met Naruto at a run. Naruto didn't have chakra to spare, so he took the spearhead on a guard and let it slide high, twisted, and used the pressure to launch himself sideways to a pylon. From there he had angle and leverage. He pushed. The pylon tipped. The mantle put up a hand like a religious gesture and tried to hold it by will. They were good. Naruto would give them that. He was meaner. The pylon went into the next pillar and the next, and then part of the lattice sagged like a net with a whale in it. Field dropped to 62. Said a voice near the pool, more upset by the number than the structure. Reset. Don't reset, Naruto said, and he didn't realize he'd used that tone again until everything in the room wavered, just a hair. As if considering him, he felt it scrape his throat on the way out. Hinata came up under a pair of mantle trying to flank, a flow of movement that put her inside their guard and then passed it with 2 precise touches that put their legs to sleep for a minute they didn't have. Sayaka shoved one with her shield so hard he met a pillar with his face. The boy held the donkey LTER and stared as if this would be a thing he'd talk about until someone fell in love with the way he told it. Naruto. Hinata's voice found him where he'd made himself a problem. She didn't look scared, but she did look like she wanted him to do the thing people would wish later he'd done. She pointed with her chin toward the pool. A mantle squad was unspooling a braided cable into it. Seals ran down the line like spine bones. Where the cable touched the glass, ripples spread, beautiful and wrong, taking a heartbeat to cross the pool. The pool itself seemed to be breathing. That inhale, that expectant stillness. I need 6 seconds, Naruto said. You never have 6 seconds, Sayaka said, reflexive and grim. Then I'll borrow, he said, and ran. He had wanted to hold onto his breath. He would have liked to budget it. But life didn't give budgets. He burned a chunk of what he had left in one move, 5 clones hitting 5 different vantage points, all of them making themselves loud in ways that didn't require sound. One knocked a spear into the pool, another shoved a mantle so his foot got caught between 2 teeth of an old machine, a third whistled by drawing a blade along stone. Making a noise, it turns out the hush carried very well. The mantle turned like schooling fish. The cable kept going into the pool. Naruto reached the edge and didn't lean in. He jumped. Later, he would think this was the stupidest possible direction. Later, he would pretend it had taken deliberation. In the moment, he moved the way his spine told him to move when the boy with the donkey made a so. Like he'd been left, and Hinata said his name in a way that made it a line he could hold in his hands. He went into the glass and found it was both less and more than glass, and then he found it was not a thing at all. It was a presence. There are moments when a life gets renamed. Naruto had had a few. On a bridge with a demon in the mist, in a field with a friend bleeding for his own bad ideas. In a war that made a boy into something that could carry more than one person's hope. This was different. The presence didn't ask for worship. It didn't even ask for recognition. It simply turned its attention the way mountains turn sunlight into shadows. Naruto had the clean, overwhelming sense of being measured and not found wanting, not because of his strength, but because he had run toward the thing that would break him to keep someone else unbroken. He didn't have a word for it, so he borrowed one, because he was very good at borrowing what he needed long enough to fix a problem. He led a breath that didn't have air in it and put it into his throat, where the hush had made a home, and shaped it. Not a shout, not force, command. The kind you use on yourself when all the worst parts would rather somebody else got hit. Stop, he said. It wasn't to the mantle or to the cable or to the pool. It wasn't to anything with a face. The word found the charge the mantle had primed and sked it politely to remember being an idea. The word touched the ripples and made them remember steps before they were footsteps. The word looked at the collapse that had already begun in a handful of avalanching pebbles and made the pebbles go back into the wall they had fallen from. The explosion unwound like someone inhaling a laugh. Sound that had been packed into a thump spread out thin and harmless across 10,000 miles. The cable twitched like an insulted snake and went slack. The mantle froze because the thing that had happened did not belong to their rulebook and therefore had not happened. Naruto stood in the pool, which was not exactly a pool anymore. He stood on something that wasn't solid the way glass was solid or air was empty. He stood on consent. The presence brushed I am like a hand not to bless but to count, and once counted, he was not owned. Witnessed. Recognized the way daylight recognized anything it fell on. Heat flooded him from the inside out. It wasn't comfortable. It was the heat of a forge before you learn to keep your hands out of it. He felt it roll up his spine and into his jaw. His teeth hurt. The hunger in his bones didn't feel like food, it felt like flight and flame and being bigger without crushing anything. Water in a crack in the wall hissed and steamed. Scales flickered under the skin of his forearms like an optical illusion, there and gone. The suggestion of armor that was not something you put on but something that let you carry more. Then the presence turned away, because it had things to be that weren't him, and the world rushed back. Naruto's knees went out, but he made it look like a decision. He put one fist down and breathed like a runner at the end of a race who had not lost. His voice came back as a raw place. When he swallowed, it tasted like the moment after you blow out a candle with your thumb and forefinger and the smoke curls in your mouth. The mantle did not retreat. Professionals didn't do that, just Becca. The world had made a joke at their expense. They recalibrated. They watched the way he had said a word to nothing and had made everything pay attention. They adjusted their priorities. Vocal primary confirmed, said the calm voice near the pool, and if there was awe there it was the kind that turns awe into procurement orders. Secondary objective achieved. Initiate collapse in Sector 4. Recover cable. Do not engage target without Field 9. Field 9 sounded like a thing Naruto didn't want near his people. He moved before the order was done echoing. Hinata reached him at the edge of the knot pool and steadied him with a hand that knew his weight. Your throat, she said, and he realized his voice had bled. Not from his mouth. He didn't know how he knew that. He just knew he had spent something words usually spent slowly, and now he'd have to pay back interest. I've had worse, he said, and it would have been cocky if not for the way his voice made an ugly sound trying to find itself. You don't have to have worse, she said, eyes fierce. We can leave. We will, he said. We'll take them with us. He made for the scholars, for the boy and the donkey, for Sayaka and the Chunin he'd used up with a hand signal and a promise. The mantle were already moving toward a corridor to the right. Dust fell there from the ceiling like the first beads of an unthreaded necklace. Had primed charges to collapse this way even if the pool had refused to play bomb. Maybe especially if it had refused. Even a failed harvest needed to be hidden. Right corridor is wired, Hinata said, scanning. Left is breathing slow but intact. Left, Naruto said. Smoke. Line breaker. Pace, he coughed. He tried to say more and found the word snagged on the scrape in his throat. Hinata touched his arm once. I know, she said. And then she spoke for him with a clarity that made his chest go loose. Sayaka, center the elders. We'll thread them through. Naruto needs 2 up front, 3 trailing. I don't need, he tried. You need people, she said. She did not soften it. She did not make it about weakness. She made it about math. He nodded and made 5 more clones. It hurt in a way that was both familiar and new. Like running in old boots that had a pebble in them now. The clones took position because they knew him and moved the way he needed them to without asking. One bent to the boy and said, "You still brave." And the boy nodded with the wide-eyed solemnity of someone finally getting to be what he had been telling himself in small, mean times. They made the left corridor, or while the mantle made the right collapse. The sound came like a belated thunder. The hush turned the thunder strange, stretching it thin and then laying it across the stones like a blanket. Dust bloomed and then settled. They kept moving. The corridor kinked, then opened into what had once been a market. Stalls now glass sculptures only the sand and memory could buy from. Eyes on the ridge, Sayaka snapped. Masks at 12 and 4. They were already there. White mantle teams had anticipated this path. Of course they had. Naruto let the frustration arrive, and then he set it down somewhere. He could pick it up later if he needed it. He had more important objects to carry. The mantle here had a new toy. It looked like a throwing dart scaled up for men with more forearm strength than ethics. Seals ran down the fletching. They threw 3. Naruto's clone bodyguard leapt, and 2 darts took clones in the gut. Each popped with the smallest possible explosion, like breaking the neck on a small bottle, and the clone staggered 2 steps before dispersing, not in smoke but in something with grain, like sawdust in water. Field 9, Naruto's mind supplied. He didn't like it. He liked the hair rising along his arms less. A warning without words. He didn't call a counter. He made one. Hinata, he said, and this time his voice came like a rope frayed but holding. He nodded toward the vaulting supports that ringed the market space. These carry. He tapped one with a fist. It sang at a pitch too low to be music and too rich to be ignore-able. They do, she said, understanding in the tilt of her mouth. What are you? He didn't say. He didn't have to. She knew him well enough to be both annoyed and willing. He made 3 clones again. It felt extravagantly wasteful and exactly correct. Those clones ran to the columns and climbed high, feet and hands finding shallow holes and old chisel marks like fingers learning a song they hadn't known they knew. Naruto faced the mantle and gave them a look like a man who was about to do something stupid. It wasn't far even from the truth. He ran at them, and they brightened. Professionally, but the way professionals do when the problem solves itself in the shape of a man who wants to be a target. They threw. He threw too. Kunai into the sand in a fan, nothing fancy, and he wasn't looking for hits, he was drawing a line. The darts came. 2 hit clones because they did their job and died like men who would be trophies in a history they didn't want to be in. The 3rd dart came for him, an inevitability with a seal on the back. He slid under it and let his heel catch it, dragging it down into the path of the line of kunai. The metal head hit the first loop of wire he'd strung with the earlier fan throw. The wire hummed, and because it had nowhere to give, the force went into the columns. The clones high on the supports braced. He heard their breath in his own throat, which was a strange comfort. They shoved, and the column tipped just enough to make the arch above decide gravity had a vote. A sheet of glass came down where the mantle had been about to surge, clean as a guillotine and 10 times wider. They weren't fools. They broke and slid back. The sheet hit the ground and shattered into drifts of knives. The corridor to the left stayed clear because Hinata had kept her eye on the tree line and a hand on his elbow. And shaped their path with a dozen small choices. Go, Naruto said. They went. The mantle tried to follow, but the narrow path favored defenders, and Naruto had a knack for using the world like it had been built for him. He dropped a smoke tag that didn't smoke so much as make the hush visible in ways that confused the eye and made the mantle's measured tread misstep. He let 2 clones bait them into their own dart field, turned them in a circle with feints until they walked into the dull cloud of suppressant they'd thrown earlier. It clung to their cloaks like something more intimate than fabric. They coughed and slowed, and that was all he needed. He didn't waste a victory by turning it into a drawn-out fight. He took the people he'd promised to take and left. They came out into the light under the broken arch as the wind remembered itself again. The sun did the thing it did here where it found a way to cut the air into knives and then apologized by making the ruins look like a sea of glass. Naruto took one breath and didn't wince at the way it felt like swallowing sandpaper. He found the boy's shoulder with his hand. It was shaking, but it was solid. You did good, he said. E-boy looked at him like that sentence would be the measure in his bones when he was old. You ordered the explosion to stop, he said, hushed. Naruto scratched the back of his head. The sand made the sound dry. I asked, he said. It listened. Sayaka snorted. If I ask my kids to clean their room and it happens like that, I'll start believing in gods. Don't, Naruto said, and the word came harder than he intended. He tried again. More even. Don't. We don't want those. We want people who do the work together. Sayaka studied him like a soldier who has learned to recognize religion even when it dresses up as practical. Whatever you say, Shinobi, she said, but it didn't come with scorn. I saw the thing you did. If gods are choices you have to keep making, I suppose I can live with that. Hinata stood at his shoulder and watched the ridge. They're regrouping, she said. We have minutes. We're taking the river channel, Naruto said, and when they looked at him as if the land of wind had developed rivers while they weren't looking, he jerked his chin at the long, low trough running south like a dry canal. It was a canal when this city had the energy to make glass sing. It's still a path. Less sand movement. More cover. He didn't have to explain. He liked not having to explain. He liked when people thought with him. Sayaka started the wagons moving. The donkey set the pace wisely. The scholars whispered and argued and then went quiet because one of them had the kind of practical sense that makes academics live longer, the sense that you can marvel later if you get to later. They took the channel. The walls were high and scored by 1,000 storms. The bottom was smooth, burnished by sand as if some delicate hand had been patiently polishing it for centuries. Naruto walked at the front because he wanted the first hit to be on him. Hinata walked at his left because she wanted the first hit to be seen before it arrived. At the third kink in the channel, Something flashed across the top. A sliver of white, gone before it could be a shape. Up, Naruto said, and 2 clones scaled the wall like lizards. One made it to the lip. The second caught a dart and dissolved in a drift that made Naruto's stomach clench. He didn't like that effect. It made dispersion feel like being unmade. The first clone threw himself over the lip and took someone down with him. White Sliver Man rolled and stabbed the clone in the throat with a short knife that knew exactly where to go to make sure even false bodies remembered dying. Naruto hit the wall at a run, using grooves cut by forgotten tools. The white mantle on the lip bought the bad odds anyway, credit where due, and met him with a slash that would have opened him ear to collarbone if he hadn't leaned exactly wrong to avoid it. He put his palm on the man's wrist and twisted like the dance instructors in Konoha would tell you not to twist because you'll break someone. The wrist broke. The knife dropped. Naruto didn't let the man go. He shoved him into his partner and then let their momentum take them down the far side of the channel. They were trained enough to roll with it, but they weren't flat on their feet anymore. It was enough. Hinata landed beside him light as if the air had remembered it liked her. 4 more. Farther along, she said. 3 above, 1 below. You take the below, he said, ND. Then he breathed out a line of heat so fine it was almost a song. It wasn't a jutsu in the shape of ones he'd used his whole career. It was smaller and stranger. It was like setting down a thread that happened to be hot. It touched the lip of the channel and made the stone sigh as if it had wanted to be that temperature all along. The 3 mantle above pivoted blind, thrown by a sensation our training hadn't prepared them for. The world-changing temperature under their feet for no plausible reason. Hinata used the blink to flow through the one below like water through reeds, tapped 4 points with 3 fingers. And set him down gently as his system went on holiday. They made the lip. The mantle decided, collectively, that now would be a good time to try field 9 again. 3 darts came humming like hornets weeping at a funeral. Naruto didn't have wires left. He had rock and a voice and a body that would answer when he told it to move. Down, he said, and the word wasn't command magic, but people obeyed. Sayaka pulled a scholar off a wagon seat so fast the scholar's hat stayed up by itself for a beat before remembering gravity. The darts took the lip and made the stone quiet. It was an awful quiet. The kind of quiet that ate echo and softened edges. Where that quiet touched a clone's ankle, the clone hiccuped and vanished like a word on the tip of a tongue that someone else stole. Naruto's skin crawled. He threw a kunai at the dart. It pinged a seal and skittered into the channel where the quiet ate its steps. Not useful. He grabbed a handful of sand and pitched it. The sand didn't behave any different. Too small to cancel. Fine. He didn't have to break the field. He only had to move out of it. Keep going, he said, and this time he didn't try to make it sound reassuring. Don't stop for any reason that isn't me. They ran. The channel kinked again and dropped into a shallow basin that had once collected water and now collected wind. The wagons rattled. Donkey ears flicked like semaphore flags. Naruto moved with the kind of efficiency that came from doing this with his life, sometimes as a child, sometimes as something you can't call a child anymore. He blocked where he had to, turned aside where he didn't, trusted Hinata with his back so completely that he didn't know he had until a blade passed through where his kidneys had been and found air instead. They cleared the basin. The channel narrowed into a slit where only one wagon could go at a time. Sayaka and the Chunin fell back smooth as a drill to form a box around the scholars. The boy with the donkey kept his jaw set so tight he'd have a headache later. Naruto loved him for it in the particular way you can love strangers who decide not to make your job harder. They came out into a steep flanked ravine and found a line across it, a rope bridge up top with planks that had not been planks in decades. White mantle stood on the far side. There weren't many. They were enough. Behind them, rigs came up. Mechanical arthropods assembling into something that looked angled for an ugly sermon. Spears, Hinata said. Of a sort. Anchors. 3 points make a triangle, triangle makes a net. Godspear, said Sayaka with a geographical sigh. They do love their naming. Naruto rolled his shoulders. He didn't have chakra for a big show. He had a new heat that wanted to be used in a throat that felt like a scraped knee. He had his hands, and he had people who would do their part. Tamari will kill me if I break her country's toy bridge, he said. You've met Tamari? The boy asked, sudden and shy. Met, Naruto said, and left it there. He took the first wagon's trace lines and untied them. We go around. Sidle along the wall. Hands on the stone. If you look down and don't like it, don't look down. The left wall had a lip about the width of a book. It wasn't comfortable, but it didn't require prayers if you kept your center of gravity over your feet and refused to argue with gravity. Naruto led, because if someone was going to discover where the lip narrowed to the width of regret, it should be him first. They made a third of the way around when the mantle decided to convince them to make bad choices. A dart hit the stone above his head and made it go quiet. The quiet propagated like ink in water. It took a breath to decide it liked his boots and tried to unmake the traction under them. Hinata, he said. Already, she said, and her palm struck the wall twice, and the quiet paused in confusion because the world had just been told in too specific, precise took. He's that it had to behave like a wall again. He did not ask how she knew where to place the touches. He would ask later when they could argue about art and science and instinct. For now he moved. They reached the far side as the mantle finished deploying their triangle of anchors. The spears sank into the stone with an offended sigh. Lines ran between them like threads that didn't exist for anyone who hadn't been invited to the conversation. Don't get caught, Naruto said. Sayaka lifted an eyebrow that said she hadn't been planning to. The scholars huddled and did their best. The boy looked at the net like a fisherman judging a terrible catch. The mantle leader on the far side, gloved hands, mask with narrow eyes, made a hand sign that wasn't a shinobi sign but meant something like ready. He hadn't looked at Naruto like a man looks at an enemy. He'd looked at him like a field sample. The difference made Naruto want to break something that wasn't his. Leave, the leader said. The hush carried it like communion wine. You are not the subject. Naruto's laugh came out mangled and truer for it. We're always the subject, he said. You just haven't admitted it yet. Stand by, the leader said to his men. And they stood by the way people do when they think standing will make the world wait. Naruto didn't. He stepped forward into the arc of the first spear and let the hair on his arms rise. The net hummed. He felt his chakra recoil from it like a hand from a stove. Good. He didn't use chakra. He used a piece of metal Tenten had made him once, a black steel hook on a line with a "we." That would have been ostentatious if it hadn't been exactly as heavy as it needed to be. He'd kept it because she'd made it and because he liked the way the world moved when it met it. He whirled it once, twice, and threw it low. It went under the first line of the net the way knives go under armor when the armor is made for the wrong kind of war. It hooked the base of the spear. He jerked. The spear shifted a hair. The hum sharpened in startled anger. He yanked again. The spear came an inch. The mantle leader gestured to two of his men. Their polite balance broke as they lunged to reset the anchor. Hinata didn't wait to be asked. She stepped into the space the spear had guarded, slid through the net with her body exactly where the hum wasn't, because her eyes could see the gaps like a music student hearing silence written in a score. Her fingertip hit the spear's binding seal and in that instant, before it could ask the net for help, she told it to sleep. Naruto jerked the hook. The spear came free. The net lost a corner. The hum sagged. The mantle leader made a sound that might have been human if he'd been in a body that left room for noises like that. Now, Naruto said, and this time the word wasn't a voice. It was urgency dressed as grammar. They moved. Sayaka took the right spear, not with clever fingers but with a shield edge and a curse. The scholars, bless them, Florida, nked her with the donkey and made themselves mass in a helpful direction. The boy held the rope and did not let go. Naruto hooked the third spear and put his back into it, his shoulder screaming at high. Like a friend who cares enough to be honest. The spear came loose like a rotten tooth, and the net wailed and was gone. The mantle broke. Not from fear, this wasn't that kind of day for them, but from math. Their field didn't work here. The thing they'd been here to provoke had happened and had not gone the way they wanted, and someone up a chain of command had written a protocol for this exact shade of failure. They retreated in good order. The leader gave Naruto a curt nod that was hatred with manners. Vocal primary, he said. We'll talk. You don't have a conversation I want, Naruto said. You'll find our questions persuasive, the leader said, almost amused, and then he stepped backward into his men and was a white sliver among white slivers, gone. The caravan didn't cheer. They weren't that kind of people right now. They did something better. They kept moving. They made a camp in the lee of a broken wall when the sun dipped and the wind remembered the moon. Sayaka and the Chun, in rotated watches because discipline sleeps badly. The scholars wrote words that tried to be equal to the day and failed in interesting ways. The boy fell asleep with his hand still wrapped in the dew. Inki's rope and his jaw finally unclenched. Naruto drank water that tasted like iron and life and sat with his back against the wall. Hinata knelt in front of him with a small kid and gentler hands. And anyone deserved at the end of a day like this. She dabbed a cloth at the edge of his mouth and the hollow at his throat. He flinched once, not because it hurt but because it felt like being seen. It's not chakra burn, she said. It's something else. The tissue isn't torn. It's strained. I talked loud, he said. You didn't, she said. You said 3 words. He counted. Down. Don't. Now, he said, and winced. Because the last one had cut. 4, if you count no. I heard you in places you didn't put sound, she said, looking up at him from under the veil of her hair. She wasn't asking a question. She was offering him vocabulary. He took it and set it aside for later when his head could make shapes out of it without grinding. You saved them, she added, as if it were only a fact like distance. By choosing. Then I'll keep choosing, he said. He didn't mean it as a vow. He didn't know why it felt like one anyway. When he slept, the world tilted. He stood in a place that wasn't a place and felt heat like a forge that had never had a day off. He did not see a dragon. He felt the idea of a body too big to fit into this dream. He felt regard and something like polite interest and something like respect. It asked him a question without words. He knew the shape of the answer. He spoke it back, not loud because loud didn't belong here. He woke with ash on his tongue. Hinata had a hand on his chest. Light as a note. The first edge of sunrise made the sand look like an ocean that had thought about forgiving people and decided to try again today. She opened her eyes. You're here, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, he said, and his voice was roughened but there. He cleared his throat and regretted it. We should move before they rewrite the rules. She smiled a little. I like it when you say, we. I don't know how to say it alone anymore, he said, and didn't look embarrassed about it. Sayaka came around the wall, armor dust silvered, hair tied back hard. The wind's in a mood, she said by way of good morning. We can make the first ridge before it decides it hates us specifically. Then we'll make it, Naruto said. He stood and stretched until his CK made a sound like a door being stubborn. He made a face. Hinata rolled her eyes with much more tenderness than that gesture usually got. The boy woke with a sigh. The donkey shook itself and looked proud of not doing anything stupid all night. As they broke camp, a glint caught Naruto's eye on the far ridge, a small mirror flash, there and gone. He felt it in his bones the way you feel a signature you haven't learned to read yet. He didn't tense. He simply put himself where the first worst thing would land and made sure that, if somebody wanted to take the measure of the world in the shape of him, they'd have to get through everyone else's choices first. Somewhere beyond the visible line of the day, a storm stood up over the sea and looked his way. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. Scales in the City of Wind. By late morning the desert had a voice again, and it didn't sound friendly. The wind came off the dunes and pushed at Suna's walls with both hands, a steady shoulder that made ropes hum and banners talk to themselves. Naruto talked the last rise and paused, not because he liked scenic pauses but because the sky was wrong. Wind country skies were usually hard blue, spare and honest. This one had been scraped with chalk. Bands of pale cloud knotted into spirals, spinning over spinning, as if a giant had put their thumb to the atmosphere and twisted. The city below glittered in ts. Sunlight flashing from tensile canopies stretched over streets to keep sand out of cisterns and people out of the sun. Tamari met them at the gate with sand still in her hair and humor like a blade laid flat. You made good time, she said, not wasting a welcome on people who already knew where they stood. Her eyes flicked once to Hinata's bandaged hand, once to Naruto's voice when he said her name and it came out a little scratched. Found a new way to pull a muscle, he said. Don't recommend it. Love the vagueness, Tamari said. Keeps me guessing. Come on. The wind is acting like it paid rent and wants its own room. They followed her into Suna's interior arteries. Ropes crossed above, nets and screens that softened the wind into something people could talk in. Market smells rode the air anyway. Citrus brine, hot brass. Oil on steel. Naruto's attention kept catching on the lines. The way the wind tunneled down alleys, the way the canopy edges made knife winds, the way eddies formed where pillars broke the flow. It wasn't just weather, it was behavior. The Ryamyaku, Hinata murmured at his elbow, reading his glance without needing it. It's not here, but, its ripples are. The desert is good at keeping secrets. Sometimes it lets one out on top just to see if anyone is paying attention. I am, Tamari said dryly. Against my better judgment, I've been paying attention for 12 straight hours. We've closed the east quarter and moved water caches to the center. That's the practical bit. Here's the weird bit. She led them to an overlook cut into a sandstone bluff. Below, a wide avenue ran toward the old glassworks, buildings whose walls still held a sheen like frozen honey. The air over the avenue moved like a river running uphill. Sand on the paving stones flowed in strands, then wove together and sprang apart. Naruto watched an eddy form around a broken post, focus down, sharpen into a spiral tight as a blade edge, then relax and slide away. Like a living thing testing shapes. If I say it looks like it's looking for something, Tamari said, I want you to assume I've already kicked myself for saying a stupid thing out loud. It is, Hinata said, Byakugan already open. There are currents under the city that aren't water. The wind is following them like a fingertip follows a scar. Tamari let out a breath that wasn't relief but wanted to be. Right, so it's not just me. The last time we had wind like this, a wall went down. I would like fewer walls to go down. Suggestions. Naruto leaned on the rail and let his eyes stop being eyes. He didn't force it. He let the city resolve into lines. The way training had taught him to see the path of a thrown kunai, the way war had taught him to see where a decision would land 3 moves from now. It wasn't chi magic so much as a habit. Take in everything, discard nearly all of it, trust the remainder. The currents want to cohere, he said. But the angles make them break. If you widen that alley mouth b. Why half a meter? He pointed. You'll stop the eddy that wants to peel your canopy up like a scab. And if we concede the main flow with what? Tamari said. Not skeptical. Productive. Heat. Naruto said, and didn't smile. Because he wasn't playing at riddles. Small, steady, places where the wind wants to touch. We've got kiln vents, she said. And men with bellows. I can put heat up ever. Why 20 meters on the avenue if I sell it like a civic bonfire party, which I can. Anything larger before lunch and I'm writing you into the maintenance budget. Let's start with not losing roofs, Naruto said. He touched his throat, thoughtful, then shook his head. No, not that, not yet. Tamari looked at Hinata. The glance wasn't, does his plan make sense? It was, he says go, do you see the same map? Hinata's smile barely crinkled. It will help, she said. I can stand at the kilns and tell them where to point the heat. Then we're already smarter than we were 10 minutes ago, Tamari said. Naruto, you're with me. If something breaks, I want you there to put your shoulder under it. He grinned. You say the nicest things. I'm saving my compliments for after nothing collapses, she said, and swung down the steps 2 at a time. They got to work. Hinata posted apprentices at the kilns and pointed their vents toward the spots only she could see, and the wind made a sound like somebody being persuaded. Tamari set runners to pull sandbags, open and close screens, lift and tie like a choir following a conductor who liked cut time. Naruto moved through the avenue, tweaking angles with his hands, a rope here. A wedge of wood under a door there. People expected him to fix things with big gestures. He liked the wrong-footed respect when he used small ones that worked. The first reek came from a direction the map hadn't promised. A scream went up from the glassworks, not human. The wind snapped, forgot to be helpful, clawed down the avenue with both hands. Across the way a canopy ripped and tried to fly away. Naruto was on the rope before the second shriek, hauling down, wrapping the line around a post, hands burning. Down. Tamari shouted. Everyone down. The third sound wasn't a sound. It was pressure. Naruto's ears popped. The glassworks, wide doors bulged and flung themselves inward, then outward, blown open by something that had been building inside long before today. A curtain of sand rolled out. Behind it something stood up and made the day feel smaller. People called it later the Sand Leviathan because there was a big monster made of sand, didn't do the terror justice. It came out on 4 legs because the hull it had been born in had taught it about columns. Its hide was plates of fused glass and sintered sand, colors trapped inside like heatwave rainbows. It turned its head and 100 angles turned with it. Everywhere Naruto's eye fell, he saw joints, places where motion had to move, and therefore could be stopped. It's seeing the wind, Hinata said, voice tight and intent. The Byakugan tracing overlays even she probably didn't have words for. It's following. No, it's being followed by the currents. Like it pulled them into skin. Then we peel it, Temari said. The feral grin was brief. Naruto, I'll take the mouth, he said, because that's where the worst things come from, and because somebody had to say a sentence that wasn't an apology. He ran. Temari ran with him, falling into pace like they'd trained together, which they hadn't, but competence didn't need rehearsal to recognize itself. She flicked her fan open with one WR. East and the city between two buildings became a wind tunnel tuned to her key. The beast turned and the wind slid under a plate on its shoulder, a perfect curl that lifted glass from sand. It roared. The sound put cracks in the air. Naruto went up and landed on its foreleg with a skid that should have stripped his boots, but the heat under his skin decided to be useful and made the glass tacky just long enough for his foot to stick. He stabbed a kunai down at the seam and felt it glance. Not enough. He jammed a tag under the edge, counted, then rolled and dropped. The tag went off with a sharp boned pop. A plate cracked. Hinata's voice came over wind and thunder. Nodes at the joints, 2 finger widths inside the seam. Strike, seal, move. On it, Naruto shouted, and ignored the way the shout rasped his throat. He and 3 clones hit 3 different joints, moving in a staggered waltz. The beast's head swung, mouth opening like a door to a kiln. Heat washed the avenue. The rope in Naruto's grasp smoked. Temari saw the decision the beast didn't know it had made and changed the world under it. Wind scissored across its front legs in opposite directions, left high, right low. It stuttered. The mouth flame blew sideways instead of down the avenue. Banners ignited in a line like falling in love with a bad idea, then snuffed when the wind flipped again. A cart rolled by on one wheel and forgot it ever had two. Center knee, Hinata called. There's a fault. Naruto took it at a sprint, threw a clone high to grab the ridge along the spine and drag its attention up, and went low. The plate at the knee had a crack like an eyelid. He dug his fingers under it, felt heat lick his nails, and let the new heat in his bones decide it wanted out. He didn't blow, he breathed. A thin line, a thread you could sew with. The glass softened with a hiss. He drove a kunai in and twisted. The beast stumbled. Its weight came down, a shifting mountain. Naruto rolled, but not fast enough. The shoulder came. A big glass shovel ready to turn him into an interesting smear. A hand on his belt jerked him sideways with the kind of strength you file under. Remember to send thank you T. Temari, he said, joy sharper than fear. Don't you get squashed, she said. Gaara will be annoyed with me for a month. They moved as a unit. Temari's wind lifted plates like scales being peeled back by an expert fishmonger. Naruto slid a hand under each peeled edge and laid a seal that made the plate forget it liked being attached. Hinata darted through the legs like a whisper, not fighting the mass head-on, just touching, precise. Telling chakra where not to go. The Leviathan reared and snapped. A chunk of roof went the wrong direction and came down as a shattered skylight. Naruto flicked a tag, and it blew a hole in the rubble just wide enough for 3 apprentices to scramble clear. One of them stared at him with soot-black face and then ran again when Hinata clapped twice without looking, the sound slicing through fear. The beast turned to roll them. Naruto felt the decision in its movement the way you feel a dog's weight shift before it bolts. He went left when left looked wrong and ended up in a pocket of air that the tumble didn't touch. Temari slid in on grid like a dancer, fan snapping closed and open again with beats in between he couldn't hear and didn't need to. They needed one more angle. Hinata, Naruto called, can you? On it, she said, and leapt higher than caution wanted, feet finding the beast's back. Her fingers found 2 nodes and starved them. The next motion stalled. Now, Temari shouted. Naruto didn't try for a great gout of anything. He exhaled a ribbon that looked like wind until you noticed it glowed a little. Temari bent the ribbon with a flick. ND turned it into a spiral, wind-lit flame, a helix that bit into the softened seam around the creature's hollow chest. Naruto felt something answer in the heat, pleased to finally be used like this. He did not push. He let the breath pull itself. The spiral drilled in and the beast's chest caved, not from force but because the shape it had made stopped being the shape it could hold. It came down with a long slide and a sigh. Plates losing coherence, glass turning back to sand. When the head finally thumped, it wasn't a head anymore, just an idea of a jaw with no purpose left. Silence took the avenue. Not the bad kind. The kind that cities make when something big finishes happening and people check if they're still people. Tamari lowered her fan and blew hair out of her eyes. I'm going to tell everyone we rehearsed that, she said. Charge for tickets, Naruto said. He bent to pick up a little girl whose foot had been cut by glass and handed her to a medic, then turned to Hinata. You saw it. I saw enough, she said. Breath steadying. She had a small cut at her temple and didn't seem interested in the idea of bleeding. It was following currents we can map. If the Ryumyuku is echoing like this under the desert, the city will call shapes again. Then we make better shapes first, Tamari said. Priority. Shore up the glassworks. They won't thank me if I lose a public building with good acoustics. They worked the afternoon like a team that didn't need to say out loud that they were one. Naruto hauled beams and shifted stones and kept moving until the low tremor in the soles of his feet dulled. Hinata directed venting and shut down eddies with 2-finger taps that made veteran carpenters revise their opinions about monks. Tamari shouted orders that sounded like jokes and people obeyed like in love. The heat got into Naruto's skin but did not push. It stayed ready. He liked that. They had barely finished triage when a runner pelted up from the market district so full of bad news he tripped on it. Lady Tamari, he said, words tripping over each other anyway. There's a seizure order. White masks, Tenten's shop. Tamari swore in Suna. It sounded like wind going through thornbush. Of course, she said. Already moving. Because why kill a city with weather when you can take its toys instead? Tenten, Naruto said, falling in with her. Konoha's weaponsmith, Tamari said. She's been here 2 months on contract for kiln-hardened fittings. She's also very much herself. Which is, he said, almost smiling. Hilarious and dangerous, Tamari said. You'll like her, if you survive her inventory. They cut across a square where a fountain had been bricked over a generation ago and now pretended to be a meeting place. The market beyond was a spill of shopfronts facing a shade net spiderweb. Tenten's shop had a bell on the door and a sign painted with a pair of crossed ceiling brushes and the legend needful things realistically priced. The door stood open. Inside, a man in a white lacquer mask held up a writ like a shield, and 2 more flanked crates already half-strapped for a quick exit. You're late, said a voice from behind the counter, as if she'd been counting to 100 and had decided to stop at 30 because she was bored. Tenten popped up from behind a crate covered in half-assembled metalwork, goggles resting on her head like a crown she didn't take seriously. And you brought a tour. Great, Tenten, Naruto said, delighted despite the situation. Nice sign. She squinted at him, then recognition clicked and her mouth did the sliding grin his friends used to make when they were about to apologize and blame him in the same breath. Naruto, I hope that hook I made you is not in a ditch somewhere, she said. He patted the coil slung at his hip. Black steel scuffed but whole, loved it enough to scuff it. You owe me a story and a drink, she said crisply, then nodded toward the masks. Meanwhile, these gentlemen are trying to buy out my patent portfolio with a piece of paper and intimidating triceps. I told them no. They mistook that for negotiation. The white mantle officer holding the writ did the thing where you keep your posture calm to hide impatience. By authority of Inter-Allied Procurement Order. You can eat sand, Tamari said, not bothering to frame it with civics. This is Suna. We don't do Inter-Allied seizure without going through my desk, and my desk has acquired the habit of catching fire when I'm crossed. We have authority, the mask said, and Naruto could hear the tone from earlier today braided into it, detached. Making notes while the world happened to other people. Your compliance is appreciated. You'll appreciate this more, Tenten said, and pulled a lever on the back of her counter. A half-dozen small steel birds unfolded from under the shelf and took off, whirring, passing over the heads of everyone in the shop. The birds shed confetti. The confetti stuck to the white masks and hooded cloaks with glue that had opinions. Naruto laughed in a way that made his throat remind him to be sensible. The birds looped and dropped tiny tagged weights that thumped against the sealed crates and then stuck too. Tenten flicked 2 fingers through a hand sign meant for seals and not for shinobi. The tagged crates hummed. Deterrent charges, she said sweetly. Not lethal, just annoying. And loud. Unacceptable, the officer said, which did not stop his companion from trying to peel confetti off his face and getting it stuck to his glove too. We will return with a greater force and an understanding with your desk. You do that, Tamari said pleasantly. Bring a broom, and a pen that won't cry when it meets paper it can't buy. The mantle retreated, the writ still held up like a charm against common sense. Tenten watched them go with a flat stare and then dropped it like a spent blade and turned her grin back up to full. Welcome to my terrible kingdom, she said. Wipe your feet, don't touch the glowing thing. Or, do, but then we all get to watch the medics enjoy themselves. You all right? Naruto asked, scanning the corners, because White Mantle never did one thing when 5 would do. I'm furious, Tenten said cheerfully. Which usually improves my work by 30%. They got past my outer doors with a suppressant fog. That was cute, but the inner OCKs still require someone who enjoys living to open them. And they were trying to grab my gyros. Chakra gyros, Hinata said, interest sharpening. Tenten pointed. On the workbench lay 3 dark, NSE rings with threading like braided hair. Stabilizers for high energy flow. Keep a channel from melting its own container when you push it. Not a god killer, I'm not in that market. But if you're winging something hot and you don't want it to chew your hand off, you use one of these. Naruto met Temari's look. Her eyebrow did a little, well, dance. He gave Tenten an honest glance with no charisma in it. They're not buying. They're stealing, he said. And they'll be back with more paper. Which is why we won't be here when they come, Tenten said, grabbing a leather apron and slinging it on. We'll be elsewhere ruining their day. You want to run a heist, Naruto said, because if you knew Tenten you heard the muscle memory in her tone. I want to heist their heist, she said. They've got a convoy staging in the sale warehouse 2 streets over. They'll lift from here and 3 other shops at once, move it under a canopy they've rigged to block eyes, and then out through North Gate under a seal that lies to nosy patrols. I have an objection to being inventory. How do you know about the convoy? Tamari asked, half impressed, half annoyed that someone else knew her city better than she wanted to admit. Tenten jerked her chin at the ceiling. Listening nails. You put them in your ceiling when you put interesting things on your shelves. Also, a friend at the kiln saw them resealing carts with a stencil that wasn't ours. She picked up one of the gyros, weighed it, then popped it into a cloth bag and tied it. Bring 2 strong backs, a fast mouth, and that heat. You're pretending isn't because your bones are currently trying to be a furnace. Naruto blinked. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, and Hinata made a noise that translated to, he absolutely knows what she's talking about and he is being insufferable. Good, Tenten said. We'll tell lies later. For now, Tamari, I need 3 minutes of wind shaped like a hand pulling a sheet. Hinata, I need eyes on a pattern of seals that will look like a dog chasing its tail. Naruto, when I say breathe, you breathe into this. She held up a funnel made of tempered clay and tightly wound that had seen better days and liked them. Even heat, low. We're going to rig weld a head you can channel through without turning the front row into slag. He looked at the funnel. We're making, what? A spear, Tenten said. As if this were obvious. Because you keep throwing yourself in front of things with your body. Make a conductor. Then your body can live to throw itself in front of something more interesting. They moved through the market like a rumor. Naruto took the back door with Tenten because the front door had acquired a relationship with White Mantle paperwork. Tamari went F-top with 2 sand nin because rooftops and Tamari had always had a thing. Hinata drifted along the shade net edges, eyes open, catching seal patterns left on alley walls like breadcrumbs someone hoped no one with taste would notice. The sale warehouse stank of hemp and oil. White Mantle moved through it with the bland competence of people whose boots never picked up dirt. A canopy had been stretched across the rafters, tight woven. Rune patched. It made the light underneath look like water at dusk. Crates lined 2 aisles. Naruto's skin said there were tags inside, and his throat said he should avoid saying anything fancy for the next hour. 3 squads, Hinata murmured from their little hollow behind a bale of sailcloth. 2 more outside. Rit boy, Tamari whispered from above. Left corner, Hinata said. Talking to a man who thinks too much of his pen. Naruto looked at Tenten. We do this quiet if we can, he said. I'm not allergic to quiet, she said. I'm allergic to boring. Good, he said, because this is going to be interesting. They split. Tamari flicked her fan and a ripple ran along the canopy, just a breath. Enough to make the net sag an inch, then recover. A few heads tilted up. The officer gestured annoyance, as if the building had insulted him. He turned back to his list, which was the moment Tenten chose to move. She slid along the aisle with a casual grace that made her vanish. Naruto had seen genjutsu artists disappear. This was different. This was a woman who knew how people looked when they were supposed to be somewhere and how not to look like that. She hooked a crate with a little wheeled dolly and rolled it into a shadow. Naruto's clone did the same with another. Hinata cut a seal line with a nail. The light didn't change. That was its own miracle. Now, Tenten whispered, and handed him the funnel. He inhaled. The heat in his chest answered like muscle. He exhaled into the funnel, slow as a kilnman who liked his eyebrows. The wire glowed, then steadied. Tenten slid a black steel sleeve into the mouth of the funnel and turned it slightly, listening to the metal like it could hum a key only she could hear. Even, she said. Hold. He held. Sweat ran along his spine. His shoulders decided to shake and he decided they wouldn't. Tenten's hands moved with a joy that would have been contagious if he hadn't been concentrating. She et the euro ring into a collar that would hold it and moved the weld like she was drawing. The metal flowed. The ring meshed. The sleeve accepted it like a throat accepting a word. Done, she whispered, and slipped the hothead onto a shaft with threads that must have been older than all their patience. She snapped a collar down, twisted, locked. Congratulations. It won't explode. Love your confidence, Tamari murmured. Flicking sand from her sleeve as a mantle 2 rows down wondered why the light looked different in the corner. Hinata touched Naruto's forearm, grounding him, and threw a glance at the officer's shadow. It held wrong. The center of the seals lay there, the mess that would pull everything into the wrong shape if it snapped. On my mark, Naruto said. He didn't use the voice. He didn't need to. His team knew where the marks were. 3, 2, now. Tamari hauled on the air. The canopy sagged 6 inches and then snapped up like a drumhead. The sound went straight to the P. Art of the human brain that hates being under a thing that is about to break. Men looked up. 2 moved to steady the poles that didn't need steadying. The officer took a step into the aisle to shout a command and Naruto shot him in the foot with a kunai. He hadn't meant to. He meant to hit the floor beside him. Sometimes the floor is not the foot. The man yelped with a sort of affronted surprise that would have been funny anywhere else. Tenten kicked the nearest crate and the wheels under it decided to have an adventure. It rolled into the aisle and took out 2 mantle at the knees. Hinata cut the center seal with a flat-handed chop that looked like she was snapping a twig and the entire web of lies flickered, now a mess you could see. Naruto ran. For a half second he thought Tamari had ved the world under him because he felt faster. It wasn't just adrenaline. The lines were clearer. The way between one thing and the next had loosened like a jar lid you weren't strong enough to open until suddenly you were. He hit the officer before the man could pull dignity around himself and use it as weapon. He didn't punch him. He grabbed the writ and ripped it in half. The officer made a eyes like a violated principle and reached for a sidearm. Naruto smacked his wrist. The gun went anywhere else. Seize this, Naruto said pleasantly. He kept his voice normal. Talking hurt like using a muscle wrong. But not enough to matter for one sentence. The fight, small, sharp, went loud for 15 seconds. Tamari dropped down from the rafters and took 3 men out with a sweep of her fan that did not bother with wind at all. It just hit. Hinata darted in and out, ghosting behind, hands raised to strike, disarming with touches that said not here, not now. Tenten picked up the spear she'd just made and blocked a baton with it. And when the baton cracked, her grin got bigger. A mantle outside blew a horn with a tone Naruto recognized from earlier, a frequency that ate attention. Time, he said. We move. Tamari. On it, she said, and flipped the canopy, just a little, creating a shadow like a road where there hadn't been one. They rolled 2 crates into that shadow and they were not there. It wasn't genjutsu. It was a trick of light and discipline and making your eyes slide. Tenten took her bags and her tools and one-hand-made sign from the front door and left the bell to ring after her. Naruto's clones took the rest. Because clones were very good at being who needed to be somewhere else quickly and uncomplainingly. They spilled into the alley with laughter swallowed down to keep the sun from getting jealous. Temari put a hand out to stop Naruto and he stopped because there are some gestures you learn to obey without thinking. A moment later a dart went past where his head would have been and pinned a scrap of paper to the wall. The paper read, "We'll talk." "Rude," Tenten said, plucking it free. The dart hissed and the whispering quiet rolled out again in a little circle on the wall. She flicked it away. "They're getting tiresome. Which is when they get dangerous," Temari said, eyes narrow. "They'll be back with the authority they think they deserved the first time. They can bring a parade," Tenten said. "I'll sell them fireworks." She looked at Naruto, the grin tapering into something franker. "That heat of yours. You're not making jutsu I've seen before." "Old trick, new breath," Naruto said. "Keep it, and keep this," she said, thrusting the spear into his hands. He looked at it. The head was dull black, ridged to catch and hold flow. The Euro ring sat nestled behind the point, caged in a lattice like a heart in ribs. It was beautiful, which is not something you say about a thing made to go through other things, but then Tenten frequently made contradictions worth carrying. He hefted it. The balance made his hand feel more honest. "I can pay," he began. "You owe me stories and drinks," she said. "And not using it like a broom handle." Temari's runner reappeared out of a gap in the world that did not exist unless you refused to see the right corners. "Lady Temari," he said, breathing earned, "East Quarter alarms." The wind number just doubled. "Of course it did," Temari said. As if the universe had done it on principle. She did not look at the spear for long but her mouth acknowledged it anyway. "You too, with me." "Tenten, I'm not staying," Tenten said. "If they want my euros, they can chase me through all 5 markets. I'm about to move my shop to wherever you are." "Welcome to the staff list I'll deny exists," Temari said crisply. "Let's go." They hit the East Quarter at a run, because at some point in every day worth remembering you run toward things people with sense run away from. The wind had matted itself into a sheet and was trying to haul a canopy off its moorings. Naruto speared the rope line and poured heat into the head and not one hair passed it. The line went taut. The Euro sang with a low hum, wicked and satisfied. The canopy decided to stay attached to the world. Hinata was already up on a parapet, pointing at a corner where eddies had turned into knives. "Here, here, and here," she called, and 3 roofer S hammered wedge blocks into place without arguing with a person who had just seen how the wind planned to put their roof in a different time zone. Temari moved the air like she was setting a table, pull here, smooth there. Make space for 2 bowls you hadn't planned on. The wind stopped sulking because she gave it something harder to be. The day stretched. They put out small crises with grim grace. People were the good kind of tired by late afternoon. The kind where your body remembers it can do more than you thought without complaint. Naruto leaned the spear against his shoulder and tried not to look like his throat had been scraped with a brick again. Hinata's gaze lingered but she let it be. She had a very good sense of which things you put a hand on and which you let stand. They ended on a roof like a red tile altar where the city put offerings to the sun and collected them again at dusk. Temari dropped down and sat with her back to a vent, fan across her knees. "If you two keep doing useful things, I'll have to promote you," she said. "You'll hate the meetings." Tenten took a pull from a waterskin and handed it to Naruto. "You owe me 2 drinks now," she said. That was a 2-drink day. He swallowed water and air. "Both necessary." "I owe you a shop," he said. She shrugged, not careless, just accepting that the world cost what it cost. "I've rebuilt worse. At least this time I get better gossip." Hinata stood at the edge and watched the eastern sky. The chalk spiral clouds had thinned under the day's heat, stretched like pulled sugar. Out toward the line where land met sea, a thunderhead was shouldering up. It had the built look of something intentional. "Hinata?" Naruto asked, reading the way her shoulders shifted. She didn't point. She tilted her chin. "There," she said. "Listen." He did. Not with his ears. With the part of him that had started paying attention to pressure and intention and the way the air got heavier when someone decided to do something you couldn't name yet. The thunderhead spoke in thunder like they do, but underneath it was a thread that made the hair on his arms rise. It felt like being called out with very good manners. They felt us today, Hinata said quietly. Good, Tamari said, not getting up. We felt us today too. Tenten made a face. If gods and storms want to send invitations, can they at least include a time and place? Sometimes not knowing is the invitation, Naruto said, watching the far tower of cloud. For a heartbeat he thought he saw a figure standing on nothing, just a glint. He knew better than to trust that kind of sight. He also knew better than to discard it. They sat while the sun decided whether to keep being a ball of fire or slide under the edge and think about its life choices. The city cooled. A child on a nearby roof laughed. That pure exhale sound that made Naruto's chest ease. Below, someone raised a flute and played a tune that must have been old enough to remember a time before wind had opinions. Tamari tilted her head and regarded him sideways. You command odd loyalties, she said. I don't command anything, he said. I ask, and then we do the work. That's command, Tenten said. You just don't do it, stupid. He snorted. Sometimes I do it. Fast. Doesn't count if you get away with it, she said. Hinata, how long until your friend up there decides to introduce himself? Hinata's smile had something private in it. He already has, she said. Just. To Naruto. I didn't get a name, Naruto said. You don't always need one, Tamari murmured. Sometimes you just need to know which way to stand. Night found them in motion still. They emptied the last of the day's sand out of their boots and went home in directions that felt earned. Naruto walked with Hinata. Tenten peeled off to go bully her apprentices into moving her stock somewhere inconvenient for thieves. Tamari climbed to the cage tower with a stack of reports she would not read like the bureaucracy wanted her to. On a quieter street, under a net that turned starlight into a grid, Hinata bumped her shoulder against Naruto's in that way that said you looked like you needed that. He bumped back with looking at her because if he did he'd say more than his throat would like. You were good today, she said. So were you, he said. I liked how we didn't die. She laughed, softly. That's a standard I can support. They climbed onto a low roof and sat with their legs dangling. The city hummed like it had just had a long argument with itself and learned something. Naruto let the spear lean Agai. NST the parapet and traced the Euro ring with one finger. The metal thrummed even at rest, as if it remembered motion and was content not to have to prove it. Do you worry? Hinata asked after a time, not filling the air with a noise that would pretend to be conversation. Yes, he said honestly. About using the voice. About taking. About what it makes in me that people will listen. They listen because you leave room for them. She said. You don't push them into your words. You walk ahead enough that they can find their steps. He nodded. The far thunderhead flexed. He could almost taste metal. When he spoke again, the word came careful. I think someone else is wearing a mantle like mine. Is he a good man? She asked, not flinching from the possibility that the answer could be no. I think he's a man, Naruto said. Which is enough to make trouble. They sat until the drum of the city changed to the softer rhythms of a place where most people were asleep and the ones who weren't. He had reasons that didn't make them reach for weapons. Naruto rolled his shoulders and stood. Tomorrow we shore up the west quarter, he said. And fix Tenten's front door. And your throat, Hinata said. You'll rest it. I'll try, he said. She arched a brow. You'll succeed. He grinned, rasped it down with a swallow, and lifted a hand in surrender. Yes, ma'am. The next day broke like it avoid them and then tried not to show it. They made rounds, the city doing the thing cities do when they decide to help themselves. Old men brought rope. Children learned hand signals because it made them feel important and because it saved seconds. Tenten installed 2 gyros in the glassworks. Vincent told the fire it could misbehave later. She was busy. Tamari rewrote a wind map on a napkin. And handed it to a captain who wouldn't dare lose it. Hinata found 2 places in the avenues where the Ryumiku's distant pull had made little forget-me-nots of pressure and placed her hand there until the stone agreed to be stone again. Around midday, The White Mantle decided to be predictable and came back to Tenten's shop with a contingent large enough to make a poet complain about metaphors. He found a note tacked to the door, closed for inventory. The bell had been moved to a little shrine around the corner where children lined up to ring it. The writ bearer tried to confiscate the bell. The bell stuck to his hand with glue that had opinions. He left it behind with dignity stretched to canvas. "We just make new kinds of trouble," Tenten said happily when Naruto found her eating sesame buns on a low wall. "It's good for the soul. Better than the other kind," he agreed. Towards evening, when the heat loosened its grip and the city exhaled, the pressure in the air that had been a threat settled into a waiting. Naruto climbed a stairwell to a watch platform alone because some thinking wants to fit into a small box with just you and the horizon. He looked east. The thunderhead was closer, taller, precise. Lightning stitched within it the way a good seamstress hides the back of her work. "Show off," Naruto said under his breath. As if in answer, a fork of lightning came down and did not strike anything. It stopped a hand span above the dunes and hung there, a pillar of light humming on a note that didn't belong to this sky. Then it vanished, not fading but deciding it had better things to do elsewhere. Naruto's throat felt dry in that specific way that has nothing to do with heat. He felt watched in a way that wasn't hostile. Assessed. The way a strategist studies a board before placing the first piece. He put his palms on the parapet and leaned forward until the stone graciously refused to let him fall. "Tomorrow then," he said softly. Not a promise, not quite. A courtesy. Something in the thunderhead shifted as if nodding. He went down the stairs and back into the city that had taken a breath and found itself still itself. Hinata met him at the bottom with a cup of tea strong enough to stand a spoon upright. Tenten yelled at a boy to stop climbing a barrel he was going to fall off of and then clapped when he jumped down safely like she'd planned it all along. Temari crossed the square with a stack of forms that really were lightly charred around the edges. Naruto took the tea and felt the rough and ready edges of the day settle. He didn't know if next day would be a fight or a rescue or a heist or all three. He had a spear that hummed in his hand and a voice that needed care and a city that had let him work with it like he belonged. He had a wind map he could see without looking and a thunderhead that would not be patient forever. He smiled a little at nothing. "Okay," he said, to the air, to the city, to whatever listened. "We'll keep choosing." Far out over the sea, lightning ran a ladder up the side of the storm and went still. Somewhere on that ladder a man stood with his hands behind his back and looked west, not in hatred, not in joy. Indecision. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The Names We Steal. Temari spread a sand map on a low table and pinned its corners with cups of tea because paper clips in Suna learned to run away. The map showed the city's throat, old canals, kiln vents, the vault quarter like a gemstone set too deep. Sunlight poured through the slatted window and turned the dust between them to gold. "You want to borrow the shard," she said, as if trying the shape of the words on her tongue. "Borrow. From our vault. Under guard." Her gaze flicked up, steady, a little amused. "You know how insane that sounds even with the tea, right?" "Borrow under guard," Naruto said. "Your watchers don't leave the room. Your hand stays on it whenever you want. We take it to the place we need it for a rite that keeps it from becoming a bomb in the wrong hands. Then bring it back. You'll still be able to cut my pay if I break it." Temari snorted. "As if you're on payroll." Hinata sipped her tea. "It's better than leaving it for the White Mantle to extract when we're busy saving another neighborhood. The shard answers to names. The wrong name makes it a weapon. The right name keeps people's roofs on." "Names," Temari said, rolling the word. "You've gone religious." Hinata didn't flinch. "You've seen the wind listen when we called it by what it was. This is not different, just louder." Temari's eyes softened, then sharpened. "I'll admit I want the shard out of the vault and into a place where I can keep an eye on it. The vault does not make me happy these days. It makes me feel like I'm holding my breath." "Then let's let the city breathe," Naruto said, and smiled without trying to sell it. "We're not taking it, you're walking it with us." Temari looked at him for a long beat as if checking if his words had knees or if they'd collapse when they tried to stand. "What leverage do I get if this goes sideways?" she asked finally. "My word," Naruto said. "Which I know is not a contract." He tapped his throat without meaning to. And, I'll speak an oath with a cost. Not one you pay, one I do. If something goes wrong, you get to call it in. Temari tilted her head. That's a weight you don't lend lightly. It's only heavy if I plan to break it, he said. Hinata set her empty cup down like punctuating a sentence. There's another piece, she said. Someone needs to bind the shard to the name we want it to hear. That someone is arriving this afternoon. Who? Temari asked. Shion, Hinata said. Temari's mouth tugged. The priestess from Oni no Kuni, she said. Last I heard she was good at telling fortunes and ruining demons' weekends. She also writes her own rights when the old ones don't fit, Hinata said. She won't demand obedience. She'll tell us the costs and ask us to choose. That's why I trust her. Temari nodded slow, like someone acknowledging a good chess move she'd missed 2 turns ago. All right, she said. You can pitch this to Gaara. Naruto blinked. He's going to ask why I am in this office and not in his. He's at the glassworks, Temari said. He doesn't get to be everywhere even on God-tinged days. She tapped the map. Meanwhile, you have something else brewing in that annoying head of yours. He smiled sideways. A convoy on the South Road, he said. Mantle. Black site transport with a suppression field that tastes like copper. They're moving something that doesn't want to be moved. I can't feel what. Hinata. A mind that keeps trying not to be quiet, Hinata said, eyes distant for a moment. And people around it pretending they can't hear. Temari's look said she both appreciated the problem and wanted to forbid it on principle. Target of opportunity. Target of conscience, Naruto said. We hit them clean, we find out what they were hauling. If it's a person, we cut them loose. If it's a piece for the shard game, we use it. You're going to tell me you can do both the convoy and my vault, Temari said dryly. He grinned. I'm going to show you. They moved as the city's shade nets shrugged into the afternoon and a festival woke up somewhere they didn't have time to name. Lanterns were being strung along the market streets for something. About the wind getting tired and letting people dance. Drums warmed their voices in courtyards. The air tasted like fried dough and cumin in the moment before a storm changes its mind. Naruto and Hinata took the south wall, then the neat, eroded steps down to the silt path where caravans favored the firm ground. Tenten waited in the shadow of an old kiln tower, a wicker bag slung over one shoulder and her hair pinned up like a dare. Brought toys, she said. Try not to break them unless breaking them will improve your day dramatically. He bumped her shoulder as they fell into step. I'm not a barbarian. You are absolutely a barbarian, she said. You just smile while you pillage. Pillage later, Hinata murmured, eyes on the horizon. They're behind the next rise. They were. The NVOY looked like something that had been put together by integers and travel expense reports. 3 trucks adapted to sand on wide tires under jute covers, 2 unmarked armored carriers front and rear, spare masks riding the rails. Weapons quiet but ready. The air around the middle carrier had the taste of old coins. Naruto didn't like it. Suppressant bubble, Tenten whispered. Looks thin. They, re-saving the full weight for the destination. Or for me, Naruto said. Arrogant, she said approvingly. We're going to do this mean and quick. No fireworks. I brought fireworks, but we're being adults. The road narrowed between 2 long mounds where the wind had deposited sand like accounts payable. Naruto went up the right mound with his hands in a little cooperation from gravity. Hinata was a ghost on the left. Tenten sprawled under a tarp and neighborly reeds at the roadside, because sometimes stealth looked like obvious and obvious got you killed. They let the convoy come under them and then Naruto dropped. He took the roof of the rear carrier like a thrown rug, rolled, and came up with a palm already on the latch. The latch had an opinion and it voiced it in a sizzle that crawled into bones. He took the shock, grunted, and smiled as if someone had told a bad joke. Inside, men shouted and then remembered they weren't supposed to make noise. He didn't give them time to recalibrate. He ripped the door with a twist, shoved his spear in, and used the butt like a wall of polite disagreement. A baton glanced. A shoulder went into a rib. Someone pulled a trigger and the bullet hit the gyro ring and questioned its life choices. The ring hummed. The bullet went sideways. Hinata dropped through the canvas of the middle truck the way a pebble drops through water and landed with 2 fingers on the pulse point at the base of a neck. The man forgot how to move his arms. She stepped past him into a fog of suppressant that turned sound to cloth. The thing in the back, what felt like a person, flicked toward her like a flower turning to the sun. Tenton rolled out from under her reeds and shot a line under the lead truck, hooked the axle with a little laugh, and yanked. The truck jerked. The driver cursed and caught it, good reflexes saving a roll. The jute cover on the middle truck rippled and then tore around an invisible point and she was gone again, on the far side, yanking a wedge. Jamming it under a wheel like she paid rent under it. Naruto met the inside of the rear carrier with his forehead because sometimes life requires an offer. The man who had been stepping forward to swing a baton at him stopped because you couldn't take seriously someone who was smiling with blood in his teeth like an apology. Naruto took the pause and made it permanent. 2 strikes, then turn, then a foot to the chest. The middle truck's door slammed. Hinata came out with somebody half collapsed under her arm. A red-haired woman with glasses and a posture like a coiled spring that had been left in a drawer too long. Her eyes were barely open and still contrived to be unimpressed. "Hey," she rasped, voice sandpapered to wit. "You're loud." "Working on being quieter," Hinata said. "Can you stand?" The woman licked a cracked lip. "If I bite you, I can run a marathon," she said thoughtfully, and Hinata blinked. "Kidding," the woman added. "Mostly, I heal with biting. It's a thing." Her eyes slid to Naruto with clinical curiosity. "And you taste like a bonfire the city is trying not to admit it loves." "Flirting during extraction is a bold move," Tenton said, stepping onto He truck's running board and flicking a small bomb into a man's hand just as he grabbed her sleeve. It expanded into confetti. "Hold that thought." Naruto took the woman's other arm. "Name, Karen," she said. "Sunagakur owes me 6 apologies and a bottle of rice wine. Your face looks familiar in an annoying way." "Later," Hinata said. "Now we run." They ran. The drivers had finally decided to earn their keep. The lead truck slewed, trying to box them against the mound. Naruto shoved Karen into Hinata's hands and stepped into the truck's path. He planted the spear like a flag. Heat woke up in the gyros with a hum that made the bones in his forearms agree to something without consulting him. He exhaled into the spearhead, thin, controlled, and the rising tire met Heat and decided to be somewhere else. The truck slid by with a squeal of offended physics. Tenton tossed a handful of caltrops where the shadow would be 2 seconds later and smirked when they hit exactly there. The second carrier swerved. The men on its rail leaned wrong and found themselves elsewhere. The officer in the passenger seat of the lead truck held up a horn that would whisk his signal along a hidden network and turned to blow it. Naruto felt the breath gathering, knew it would summon cutlery from every drawer in 100 yards, and flicked a kunai. It pricked the horn's bell. The sound came out as a sulk. The officer looked at the horn. Then at Naruto like someone had cracked the sky and he knew exactly who to blame. "Go," Naruto said, and his voice did an unwise rasp that Hinata heard and filed. They ate the cut across an old canal bed and vanished into a culvert that washed out 2 streets later into the cool lizard belly of the city. The mantle didn't follow. They had rules about chasing in Urba. Warrens and rules about writing reports about why you didn't. Naruto appreciated their discipline in the way a man appreciates a wall he can run along instead of into. Karen leaned against a pillar and put her hand flat on the stone as if it had done her a favor. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and when she opened them the annoyance had receded enough to let gratitude show through like a shy guest. "Thank you," she said. Simple, human. Then, to Hinata, "You knew the pattern of the suppressant. You broke it at the hinge." "Nice." Hinata inclined her head. "You felt it pushing against you." "I taste the air," Karen said, which sounded coy until you heard the fatigue behind it. "I can feel when it's wrong." "You can, too," she added to Naruto, eyes narrowing. "But yours is loud and hot and not aimed at people unless they deserve it." "You're a censor," Hinata said gently. "I'm whatever I have to be to not go back in a box," Karen said, showing teeth that weren't smiling. "Who are you 3 and why do I like you already?" Tenton said, fanning herself with her apron like a noblewoman in a play. "Naruto." "Hinata. We're hiring. Benefits include not dying and making other people do more of it." Karen looked at Naruto again as if trying on a pair of glasses that made the world either funnier or sharper. What are you? She asked. Trying not to be a problem, he said. He ked the way she took that at face value and still didn't back down. All right, Karen said, and the word had a weight you don't get without surviving the wrong kind of men in masked rooms. I'm in. If I want out, I bite someone and leave. Quote, that seems fair, Tenten said. Please fill out the onboarding paperwork that spontaneously combusts if you lie. Kidding. Mostly. Naruto hid a grin. We need to show you to someone, he said to Karen, and then we need to steal something in front of the owners while making them feel like we've given them a promotion. Karen looked delighted. Heists, she said. I adore honesty. They surfaced near the river quarter just as the first festival drums stepped into time. Paper fish on poles bobbed along alleyways, lanterns like fat moons gathered in courtyards. The air made promises about fried batter it might not keep. Tamari met them under a carved lintel and took in Karen with a glance that measured, then welcomed. Welcome to Suna, she said dryly. We offer dry heat and lots of opinions. What did they want you for? My nerves, Karen said, not coy now. She tapped her temple with one finger. I can feel orders when they happen, sometimes, if the person making them believes in their own voice enough. I think your white masks thought they could calibrate their toys off me. Temari's mouth flattened. We're burning that lab if it's within reach, she said, almost idly. Put it on the list, Naruto said. Right now, we need to get to the shrine square. Shion will be there. Who else is invited? Tamari asked, falling into step. A city, Naruto said. The shrine square wasn't a square so much as a widening in the web of streets where the stone had been cleaned too many times to hold much dust. Stalls hugged the edges tonight, children chased a ribbon dancer. A man sold sweets shaped like turrets from the old glassworks. At the center stood a shrine with a roof like cupped hands and bells hung along the eaves to teach wind how to sing. Shion stood in its shade watching the bells argue. She had the calm of someone who had learned to carry quiet deliberately. Her pale hair fell straight down her back, her eyes were the kind of clear that made people confess. When she saw Naruto, she didn't perform surprise or joy. She smiled like a person who had known for some time that the next step would be this one. Naruto, she said, voice even, not sleepy, not eager. You brought sand on your shoes and a promise on your mouth. I'll sweep, he said. And keep the other one. She moved her gaze over Hinata, respect blooming there like something relieved. You look well, she said softly. You, too, Hinata said, warmth blooming under her calm. Shion's gaze found Tenten. Sparked, then Karen, paused, then nodded with the seriousness of someone recognizing someone else's spine. You're making the right kind of mess, she said. Good. Tamari cleared her throat. We're about to make a version of that mess in my vault, she said. With permission. With vows, Naruto added. Shion's eyes flicked to his throat, then back up. Good, she said again. Because you're about to ask the world to listen to you and not to the people who shout. She took a folded cloth from the shrine, old linen, dyed with saffron, and laid it on the stone. She placed 3 small earthen cups on it and filled them with water from a skin that had a string of prayer knots around its neck. Before you go, she said, put your names in the water. Not the ones you were handed as children. The ones you're living by this week. Tenten's mouth did a little kiss of curiosity. If I say, Tenten, will you scold me for not playing? Shion smiled. If that's your name this week, it will hold. Tenten's grin softened mischievously and she dipped 2 fingers in the first cup. Tenten, she said, maker of things that behave as long as I make them feel watched. The water took it, rippling like a cat considering a lap. Hinata touched the second cup. Hinata, she said quietly. And one corner of her mouth lifted. I see where the wind pretends to be shy. I help it be honest. Karen looked like she wanted to be snide and then looked, instead, like someone whose mouth had just discovered it could say gentler things without being punished. Karen, she said, and it came out like a decision. I find the orders in the air and bite them until they let go. Tamari eyed the third cup like it might bite back. She touched it anyway with fingers still calloused from years of fanwork. Tamari, I stand between storms and the people who can't reach high enough to tell the storm to stop. If you try to go around me, I make myself wider." They looked at Naruto. He wanted to joke. He wanted to deflect. His throat ached. He touched the water. It was cool and stead like the shrine had decided to be kind to him. "Naruto," he said, and then, because the water wanted more, "I am the person who, when told the road is shutting, makes another road with my feet. I don't take mouths away. I take hands when they're slipping." The bells under the eaves chimed. Shion watched his face the way you watch someone sign a document with their own blood and not for theater. "Good," she said again like a satisfied toll. She packed the cups and the cloth. "Let's go steal something with everyone watching." They didn't storm the vault. They strolled in with a festival on their heels. Temari walked like she owned the building because she did. Guards straightened but didn't block the door because her look asked them if they had the energy for a bad day. They didn't. Son A's vault was a room built by people who had decided vaults should not be clever. It was thick. The doors didn't have visible hinges because the wall still remembered being part of a cliff. The inner lock was a lattice of seal work. All loops and counterloops and passive-aggressive posture. Naruto understood none of it and didn't try. He watched instead, not with chakra sense, with that new habit his bones had of noticing intent. The lock wanted to keep out thieves. It wanted to keep out explosions. It did not know how to keep out a promise unrelated to pain. Temari signed the book because she enjoyed making clerks nervous. The clerks pretended to be calm because they were professionals. One of them fetched a key so heavy it could be a weapon and fitted into a slot that was too small for it until it wasn't. The door sighed. The air inside had that museum quality, cool, indulged, slightly prone to scolding. The shard sat on a low plinth like a chunk of sunset trapped under amber. It wasn't smooth. It had faces like a cut crystal, but the cuts were wrong, or rather, they belonged to a geometry that had roots farther down than this building. When Naruto looked at it, his throat went ho-tea as if he'd inhaled the first breath off a kiln door. The shard looked back the way a deer looks at a clearing, ready to bolt, sure of its legs. "Touch nothing unless I say," Temari said to no one in particular and everyone in general. "Even with my eyes," Tenten murmured. "Especially," Temari said. Shion stepped close enough to feel its hum and no closer. She set the saffron cloth on the plinth's edge and placed one of the earthen cups beside it. She looked over her shoulder at Naruto. "You're not going to talk," she said, which annoyed him because he'd been hoping to sneak one word in somewhere. "My voice is paid out to the city already today," he conceded. "You'll pour," she said. "When I tell you, and you'll mean it." Karen shifted her weight. "You're binding it." Shion didn't look away from the shard. "I'm asking it a question and making it expensive to lie," she said. "You can hear orders in the air. You'll hear when it agrees or doesn't." Hinata took position at Shion's left, eyes open to how the room breathed. Tenten slid to her right and watched the seals that ringed the floor, the kind of protection clever enough to trip its own users if they forgot where they'd started. Imari stood with one hand on the door frame because it was her house and because she'd said so. Shion lifted her hands, palms up like a person offering nothing. "Amber that called itself a vessel," she said, voice not loud, not reverent. "Simply clean. We need a bowl, not a blade. Listen. We'll not pour blood into you. We'll pour names. We'll pour work. We'll pour the breath of a city that wants to stay a city. Will you hold that and not hunger for more?" Karen's head cocked. "It's listening," she breathed. "It has teeth. It's allowed to," Shion said. "We all do. It just shouldn't use them on our hands." She nodded to Naruto. He lifted the cup. The water quivered in it like a bird deciding whether to leave a branch. He tipped it. It ran over the shard's nearest face, down a seam that caught light. Around a corner that shouldn't have been there because geometry was being stubborn. The door behind them sighed. Not the vault door. The outer door. Then a bell up the hall rang 3 times. With that particular rhythm that makes soldiers' shoulders tighten. Temari didn't look back. "The guards did," she said, without moving. "Stay," and they stayed because she somewhere had learned how to put iron in syllables. Shion touched the saffron cloth to the dripping water where it ran across a face that reflected light like a thought. She spoke a name Naruto had never heard before and felt, at once, the shard weigh it. It didn't understand, exactly. It understood the idea of understanding. Karen, Sheehan said without looking up. Tell me when the air turns. Karen shut her eyes. Now. No, now. The ceiling above them lit with her words as if her mouth pulled cords in the room. A seal line flared. Tenton had already stepped. Her brush was in her hand. The line she laid looked like a casual doodle and was in fact a wedge. The room's seal work took offense and then settled, the way a cat settles when a more aggressive cat is present. White mantle, Hinata said, not a question, gaze on the hull through stone. 6, 7. They have a starving net. Her breath tightened. Naruto, if your voice was a door, they brought a doorstop. Cool, Naruto said through teeth. I hate their toys. Tamari didn't turn. We finish, she said. Then we arrest our guests for bad timing. Sheehan laid her palm on the cloth, and Naruto felt the shard turn its listening like a dog turning its head. Promise once, Sheehan murmured. Not forever. For a season. For a city. We'll renew when roofs need it. The shard thrummed. The nhhh of it rode Naruto's bones and made him want to cough. He didn't. Sheehan's mouth bent. It would like a counter-promise, she said. It wants to be used, not stored. Good, Tamari said. Me too. Sheehan lifted her hand. Done, she said, and the seal ring on the floor sighed with a sound like something not getting its way. The white mantle chose that moment to come through the door because they loved an entrance. They wore their bone-white pretty, Ks tidy even after they'd bullied a clerk to get the inner door open. The officer in charge had a face Naruto recognized by how much he didn't care about it. This is a private ceremony, Tamari said, in the voice she only used when people would bleed if they didn't listen. The officer didn't look at her. Vocal primary, he said to Naruto. You'll come with us. Now, we will take custody of the object. Naruto lifted the empty cup. You're late, he said. Sheehan folded the cloth and tucked it away. The shard sat, glinting with the particular satisfaction of a tool about to do the work it had been made for. Karen's mouth went crooked. They brought 9, she said, eyes distant. No, 10. One outside with a string on the others. If you break the string, the kite falls. I can find him if you give me a minute. 30 seconds, Tamari said. I'll only promise you that many. Tenton took the cup from Naruto, flipped it, and set it on its mouth, a challenge you could trip over. We're not doing this in here, she said. Too many things to break that I like. Out, she told the white mantle like you tell goats they're in the wrong field. They didn't move. The officer turned his wrist and men in the back pulled a net from a tube like a rolled-up prayer mat. It hummed. Hinata's pupils narrowed. Sheehan's stance changed a degree you wouldn't notice unless you'd seen her bend demons into treaties. Naruto rolled his shoulders and put himself in the way because he could do that on autopilot. The first line of the net stared at his throat as if it had a crush. Heat rose in him ready tea. Obi used like a rope held back by 4 very sensible hands. He didn't speak. He breathed. He slid sidewise. The line grazed his shoulder and the hum made him blink and remember heat in a cave in AW. Ord that made explosions forget themselves. Hinata moved like script written in the margins. Her hand touched 3 parts of the net in the time it took Tenton to make a face and call something rude. The net hiccuped, lost the note it needed, and sagged. Tamari finally turned. Get out, she said again, and this time the word was wind. It moved, not at them, but past them, and the covered rules of the vault sighed as if saying, thank you, finally a language we can read. The mantle took a step without meaning to. Tenten's boot met a shin. The shin re-evaluated its life choices. Karen tilted her head. String is north by west, she said. Roofline, 2nd terrace. He smells like old paper. Go, Naruto told her, and liked that she did not hesitate, did not ask permission she did not need, just went, fast and low. Like this was who she had always been. They fought in close quarters for 15 seconds, then Tamari drove them out into the hull by the simple expedient of turning air into a hand that insisted. The festival's drums outside had fallen into a rhythm that made your feet remember what they were for. People were singing 2 streets away. The hull smelled like saffron and stow. Nay, and the edged sweat of men who were about to lose face in front of a god and hate it. They got the mantle to the outer door. Street air hit them. The officer made a sign that meant retreat wrapped in regroup. Tenten tossed a little metal bird into his hood. It beeped once and then painted him with a powder that made him look like he'd been wrestling a pastry. He didn't blink. He had too much ego for blinking. Naruto saw the lightning before he heard it. It stood up from the street like a pillar. No, stood down, from the sky, cut cleanly, exactly where it wanted to be. The world made room for it. A man stood on the top of that light, bare feet on nothing, hands at ease behind his back. He had skin like thunderheads at dusk and eyes that held storms like pets. He wore no mask. His presence didn't require one. Daichi Yatsuki, Tamari said under her breath, and didn't attempt to make the name smaller than it was. He stepped off the lightning and landed as if stairs had been patiently waiting for him. People noticed. The festival's ribbon dancer stopped with ribbons midair. Bells rang on the shrine and sounded both delighted and alarmed. Daichi looked at Naruto with the complicated eye, interest of a man who sees both a rival and a thesis. He took in Hinata, Tamari, Tenten, Shion with a strategist's eye, cataloging potential, dismissing nothing. He looked at the white mantle with polite distaste, as if they were bureaucratic grease on an otherwise fine mechanism. Uzumaki, he said, his voice had weather in it. It was not a performance. It was a fact. You have something that shall not be stored and should not be in your hands. Tamari stepped forward, and the corner of Daichi's mouth acknowledged her like a neighboring storm. It's in my hands, she said, and it will be used to keep roofs on. If you are about to propose a sharing agreement, you can start by advocating from your heels. Daichi's gaze flicked back to Naruto. This world is not built to hold more than one focal point of that kind of power. He said mildly, multipolar gods make bad weather. Give me the shard. I will be very good at being the person who takes that choice away from every other man who thinks he can manage it. Tamari already told you whose house you walked into, Naruto said quietly. He wanted to rasp and refused. I'm not trying to be a god. I'm making sure no one else gets to make that a job description. Daichi smiled the way a patient teacher smiles when a bright student misses the point in the most interesting way. It's not about you, he said. Lightning whispered on his shoulders like a shawl adjusted. It's about entropy. Somebody will take it. Better someone who knows what to do. People, Naruto said. People do the work. Daichi tilted his head slightly. And when people fail, who catches the consequences? Us, Naruto said. With our hands. Lightning rippled, a warning without anger. You have a good mouth for speeches, Daichi said. Your tactics are better. Don't make me prove it in front of this nice church. Shion, who had been watching Daichi with the unsettling calm of a priestess who has seen gods throw tantrums and then asked them to sign forms, lifted an eyebrow. If you plan to fight, she said, please make oaths. It saves children's legs. Daichi's eyes slid to her. He laughed, genuinely, and bowed a fraction. You have my respect, he said. And my word. I will not strike at those who cannot reach my shoulder. Shion's gaze flicked to Naruto. Her mouth asked, and you? Without moving, he heard the question the way he heard far thunder. I make the same, he said, hoarse. And the air took the promise like a piece of paper on a desk that had been waiting longer than he'd known to be signed. Good, Shion said. Now you may misbehave. Daichi moved first because lightning doesn't wait for you to begin. He lifted one shoulder and the air turned bright. Naruto moved not to meet it but to move it somewhere else. Tamari snapped her fan and the street buckled, not breaking, not harming, just lifting, making a new angle. Lightning that would have gone through a stall full of sesame buns went into air already leaving. Naruto sprang off a raised stone and met Daichi midair where the world is less attached to the ground. Lightning kissed his skin. Heat answered like a friend in a bad bar fight. They struck, not to maim, not to kill, not yet. Testing. Daichi's hand moved like a blade made of weather. Naruto's spear turned, hummed, bit. He felt the euro catch a thread of lightning and ground it like a man plugging in the right appliance. The spear sighed, almost content. You'll break that toy, Daichi observed with mild interest as they broke and touched ground again. Then what? Then we stop making each other's day interesting, Naruto said. Which was almost funny. The white mantle had retreated to the edges, watching like auditors who hate the way art happens anyway. Karen's hand flicked up from a low wall 3 houses down and made a small, precise gesture. String cut, she called, voice carrying with clean assurance. Your man on the roof forgot to believe in his own order. The mantle who had been making the net sing went suddenly fascinated by the idea of leaving his body. Tenten clapped once. Nice bite, she said, without looking away from the street. Daichi's eyes flicked toward the fallen man, then back. No irritation. Simply update the board. This is messy, he said. He lifted 2 fingers. Lightning made 3 steps in the air between them. He took one, as if walking up an invisible stair. Naruto did not follow to that height. He didn't have to. Temari was already turning the world so that Daichi's perch would be inconvenient. Hinata ghosted along the edge of his sightline, reading where T. He next strike would try to make the street into a target. Naruto's clones took positions that were not heroic, just smart, blocking angles that would have boxed people. Shion stepped forward and track. Ed a circle on the ground with a length of salt string, old as ceremony, new as this hour, and murmured a name that made the lightning find new hobbies on contact with the circle. Daichi smiled again, faintly. You're coordinated, he said. I approved your choice, Naruto. This is why I want the shard. Because you can make people into more than their parts, and I can make that a principle large enough to save fools from themselves. Can you? Naruto asked, lifting his spear, feeling the tired throb in his throat and the eager hum in the metal. Or will you just make obedience and call it order? Semantics, Daichi said, and then he came down like a guillotine. Naruto didn't meet him head on. He had been that boy once. He had reformed that part of his body with discipline and pain. He went aside and under. And the spear sang a low, private note and caught a slice of the lightning, flicked it into a drain where soon as Under City swallowed it with good manners. Daichi turned, moving faster, testing a different angle. Naruto felt himself outpaced half a step. He let it happen and used it. He fell. Daichi followed to finish. His weight and lightning pushed him into a pocket of air. Ari had shaped which was not there a heartbeat before. Hinata's palm struck. Not to break. To remind lightning it had a body attached. Daichi's left shoulder stuttered. Naruto spun in the space that be. Ought him and swept the spear's butt up into the place under the ribs where even gods remember breath as a thing. The hit landed. Daichi's eyes warmed. Respect like a coin tossed across a table. They moved. The street tried to keep up and did a good job. The crowd did not panic because the oaths had sunk into the air and held. Tenten hurled a hook that caught a ribbon of lightning and pulled it like thread through a needle, weaving it into a sign that would read no if anyone had eyes trained to the right spectrum. Karen laughed under her breath in the way you do when your body recognizes that why. Our brain's hope is not foolish this time. Enough, Daichi said, not angry, just done measuring this shape of the problem. He stopped completely, which was the most alarming thing he'd done yet. He looked at Naruto and the others, at Shion's circle, at Hinata's palms, at Temari's angle, at Tenten's mischief, at Karen's teeth, and nodded like a craftsman acknowledging another workshop. You won't give me the shard, he said. You will also not misuse it. For now, Naruto said. I'll take the larger piece later, Daichi said conversationally, as if adding an item to his list. At the source. Be ready to explain to me then why your plural is better than my singular. Be ready to be wrong, Naruto said, too tired for style. Daichi's smile was small, genuine, exasperated in a way that said he did in fact like a world where things argued back. If I'm wrong, he said, we both get something better than what we came for. He lifted his hand a fraction. Lightning came up under him into a column, a polite elevator. He rose, paused clean, and was gone. The storm on the far horizon flexed and then turned its face elsewhere. The white mantle, who had committed the sin of being boring. In a room where weather had flirted with theology, dissolved backward into alleys because their protocols had finally caught up to their failure. One dropped a piece of paper that said compliance in tall, humorless script. Tenten picked it up and used it to line a crate. People breathed. The ribbon dancer finished the figure she'd stopped in simply because stopping mid-figure offended her aesthetic. The bells under the shrine's eaves rang once in relief. Shion put her heel on the salt string and ground it into the stone with neat economy. He'll be back, she said, not a prophecy so much as good sense. And he'll have sharpened his argument. Tamari rolled her shoulders and made a rude gesture at the sky. He can come fill out a requisition form like everyone else, she said. Then, softer, to Naruto, you with me. For as long as this takes, he said. He wanted to sit immediately. He didn't. Karen strolled back over the rooftops with the kind of insolent balance people are born with or pay for in scars. She dropped to the street like a cat that knew the ground was going to be where it always had been. Your string man told me a lot without meaning to, she said, stretching a shoulder until it popped. There's a larger array being built. They'll use it to pin both you and Lightning Boy to the map. I don't know the geometry yet. I can smell the budget. Godspear. Tenten guessed. Call it whatever makes them feel important, Karen said. I call it, the thing I'm going to mess up. We're going to need to move the shard, Sheehan said, practical in the way that saves lives. My circle will hold a day. Maybe two. Then it will want to be renewed. And Tamari should not have to hold her breath in her own house. Tamari blew air out through her nose. I like this priestess, she told nobody. We'll take it to the old glassworks. It's built to behave badly without breaking. And Gara owes me 3 favors. I'm cashing one. You're going to put it in a room with windows, Tenten said. Eyes bright with the creative problem-solving lust that was her true vice. I love you. Tell me that after we survive the audit, Tamari said pleasantly. They carried the shard through a city that had just watched a sky duel and decided it would keep eating dinner anyway. People were like that. Someone offered them sesame buns because this was the kind of day that made you give sweets to heroes and also to yourself. Naruto took one, chewed carefully, and let the sugar settlement in his blood remind him that being alive sometimes tasted like simple things. At the glassworks, the shish. Ard sat where a furnace had once bullied sand into flow. Sheehan laid the cloth again and rested a palm on it, and it agreed to stay as much as anything agreed to anything around Shinobi. Hinata put 2 fingers under Event's lip and told the room which way to breathe. Karen walked the perimeter with her eyes half closed, counting orders in the air. Tenten mounted the spear above the door, not as a threat, but like a bell. If you think you get to come in here without knocking, ring this first, she told the empty space. Tamari propped her fan against the wall and leaned back, the ache of the dog. Why settling into her bones like a dog deciding to lie down? We're not sleeping much this week, she said. Naruto swallowed. His throat objected. He kept his voice low. We'll make time after, he said. Hinata looked at him, the amusement and love and worry in her eyes woven into something clean. You'll rest your voice, she said. Or I'll make you sit while I talk for both of us. He smiled, guilty and grateful at once. You already did. Then I'll do it louder, she said, and squeezed his hand. It amazed him sometimes, the ordinary courage it took to say simple things on days like this. She unpacked her linen and cups with the care you use for tools that have done what you asked with dignity. I'll write the oaths we'll need for the next step, she said. Bring me honest witnesses. Oath. With only gods and liars listening tend to bend. Karen looked up from the perimeter. I can find you your witnesses, she said. I can smell truth. It stands different. It makes different mistakes. I'll make copies of all of this and put them somewhere stupid, Tenten offered. Like under a jug of fish sauce in a restaurant that is always busy. Thieves are lazy. Bureaucrats are worse. Tamari lifted her head. We do this, she said, softer than a command, stronger than a hope. We keep the city a city. We tell storms their place. We put our names on the day. They stood around the Shardell. Like people around a small fire that will never warm the whole room but will keep your hands human. Outside, the festival found its moment. Music bled into the street and then into the glassworks, thin and sweet. Naruto's throat ached. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He let the weight of the day settle into muscle and bone and promise. He let his hand close around Hinata's for the space of 3 breaths. And in those breaths he admitted to himself that love was not just a vow you made to work. It was the work. Much later, when the lanterns had guttered and the cooks had put their ladles down. And even the white mantle had gone someplace boring to write themselves absolution, Tamari climbed the cage tower and looked east. The storm out there had not forgotten them. It pulsed like a heart behind a rib cage made of miles. Tomorrow, she said, and the wind agreed. Naruto couldn't sleep. He went up onto a different roof, one without witnesses, and sat with his back against a chimney. He worked the spearhead with loving attention, oiling the collar, checking the ring, the motions the kind that make your mind admit it needs to be quiet for a moment. Hinata's shadow joined without announcement. She handed him a cup of tea. He held it and let the steam do what his pride wouldn't. You did well, she said. I didn't break my word, he said. You won't, she said. It's not a thing you know how to do. That's not true, he said, honesty lancing him. I know how. I've held back honesty when it would have cut someone I loved. I've said later when later would be worse. You keep choosing, she said. That's the difference. You don't hand the day to fear and call it wisdom. He looked out at the calm city, at the quiet square and the sleeping roofs. Karen thinks I taste like bonfire, he said. Is that a problem? Quote. Hinata laughed softly. I like fires, she said. They keep people warm. You don't burn things because it looks good. You burn what would hurt people if you didn't. He breathed, and the breath did not hurt as much. Thank you for talking when I shouldn't. You can say, please, and, thank you, she said, amused. I'll do the paragraphs until your throat forgives you. He tilted his head. What if I want to do a paragraph of kissing? Then you'll whisper, she said, and kissed him anyway, brief and grounded, the kind of kiss that finds the world first, not fireworks. A wind chimed 2 houses over tangled and untangled itself. Somewhere a cat made a decision about a fence and changed its mind. A man on a far rooftop leaned on a railing and looked at the same future from a different angle and thought the same word, tomorrow. Far out on the water, the storm rolled one shoulder. In a room with maps and cruelly neat files, a white-mantled director etched a rune into the margin of a plan and wrote, New Array. Both targets. And in the old glassworks, the shard sat under Shien's cloth and listened, pleased that someone had finally asked it to hold something worth weight. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Sea That Stands Up. The wind left Suna like a guest who'd learned better manners. 2 mornings after the shard took its place in the old glassworks. A runner brought a message from the east with salt dried into its edges and worry stitched into every word. Wave. Typhoon early. Wrong spin. Tied lines like rope. Tamari didn't waste speeches. Go, she said, jabbing her fan toward the map. If this is a test, pass it out there, not on my desk. They went. Tenten traveled light in the way people do who can build what they forget. Karen laughed at the idea of packing and stuffed a compass and 3 pens behind her ear. She untied a bundle of salt rope and tucked prayer slips into her sleeve like she was bringing bread. Hinata's kit doubled in weight with gauze and breath. Naruto took the spear and his throat bandage and the quiet he'd told himself he could keep. They hit the road early enough to make their shadows long. By noon they'd cross said stone into scrub and by night they camped where the desert gave up on staying dry and let the air taste like rain from a country away. Naruto dozed between watch changes and dreamed of water trying to stand and forgetting how. And waking with his palm pressed to the sand as if holding it down would help. The land of waves was greener than memory, low fields slick as mirrors, paths like wet threads. Houses with roofs that knew they were close to ocean and had made peace with it. Men in raincoats argued in doorways because arguments kept fear from getting ideas. The sea beyond the reed choked. River mouth heaved under a sky already practicing. We're early, Hinata said on the quay, eyes open to lines other people called superstition. Good. Early is how you insult weather, Tenten said, setting her bag down and staring at the boats like they'd said something rude. Who's in charge? Knew you when you were shorter, said a voice like a rasped plank, affectionate with a stubborn core. Chizuna stood at the end of the pier with a coat already soaked and a hand the size of a paddle clapping Naruto's shoulder. He had more gray now and less patience for people who liked titles. You didn't bring an army. Brought people who work, Naruto said. Chizuna's eyes flicked to Hinata, to Tenten, to Karen, to Shien, Wade each nodded. Good, he said, as if the word had been waiting under his tongue all year. Storm's wrong. Never seen it stand like that. Come see. He led them up the lighthouse. It wasn't a lighthouse anymore. Not properly. More a memory of one, brick remortared by volunteers and kept lit as a kind of civic dare. From the top they could see the ocean rise in humps and fall in trenches. Out to the east the horizon wasn't a line. It was a wall. Typhoon's spine is bent, Hinata murmured. It's not spinning clean. It's being pulled. By who? Tizuna asked. Shien's answer came quiet. By what? Karen had been standing with her palms on the brick, eyes half shut. She opened them and the humor had gone measured. Orders in the air, she said. Not one, not tidy. A dozen little ones, stitching themselves into a big one. They smell like lacquer and money. Towers, Tenten asked. Anchors. Karen pointed along the bay, then inland along the coast where old watchtowers rose out of the trees like unwanted memories. There, and there, plus the thing we're standing on. Somebody hid a toy in your lighthouse, old man. Tizuna swore in a way that suggested he'd been saving the good ones. I told them they could shore up the brick if their paperwork was clean. They said weather service. Ha, white mantle, Tamari would have said. Naruto said it for her, and the word tasted like grit. He put his hand on the iron railing and watched the way the water drew lines toward the base of 3 towers to the north and 1 to the south. A triangle made a net. Big net. The feeling in his throat that had been quiet since Suna shifted, not bad yet, just ready like a coiled spring that knew the weight of the door it would catch. Plan, he said. 3 fronts. Evacuation. Harbor hold. Anchor cuts. Tenten's mouth already had a grin in it. Call me we. And it's time to invent a thing that shouldn't work in wind. I'll pretend it's always been a classic. Hinata's eyes were on the understructure of the pier. I can sever the anchor seals if I can get the south pier and the east breakwater. The net will reroute if I don't get at least 3 before it notices. Shien, Naruto said. Salt, rope, bells. I'll draw a belt around the harbor and excuse the storm. It will leave footsteps on the line when it tries to cross, she said, already choosing corners in the city with her gaze. I will need hands. Honest ones. Tizuna, Naruto asked. The old man's grin put 10 years back on him. You get carpenters, netmen, boatwrights, divers, and 2 boys who can carry more rope than shame, he said. And I'll ring every door until I shame the stubborn to higher ground. Karen, Naruto said. She tapped her temple. I build a grid. Everyone who goes into that slick soup does it in a box I can feel. If a box goes empty, I'll know where to point you. Naruto nodded. The wall of weather out there shouldered closer like a man entering a room with no intention of asking permission. He spread his palms. Clones will run evacuation chains and fetch what needs fetching. Do not try to keep track of all of me. Just use me. Tenten bumped his shoulder. Comforting. Truth, he said. Let's move. They moved. Wave was good at making itself into a machine when water tried to take it apart. Runners went with orders down streets that had been canals once and might be again by night. Nets came up dripping from sheds. Doors banged open. Someone said, "Oh, a pot of broth because that's how you keep the stubborn cooperative." Naruto walked the pier and people turned their arguing into motion in the space his shadow crossed. He forgot to be embarrassed about that because lives moved faster than pride. Clones snapped into being and spread like bright shirts up and down the quay. One jogged past a knot of teenagers and handed them rope and a job. 1D. Ove off a rusty scow and came up with a child and a bucket. One knelt by a man who thought he was fine until someone asked him not to be. Shien began to write the belt. Salt traced clean lines on stone. Ropes stretched between iron rings and driftwood posts as if they'd been meaning to hold that shape all year. She sunk bells into the line at intervals that had more to do with sound than spacing. When the bells jangled, they sounded like a voice reminding other voices to sit down. Salt, rope, bell, she said to the women she'd recruited from kitchens and markets, showing calloused fingers how to tie the knot that would hold under the first slap of wave. If a child runs toward the water, call, don't chase. The sea eats people who chase. They nodded with eyes that had done this lesson before. And were doing it again because that's how this place kept its dead count low. Tenten broke a boat to make 5 boats. She conscripted 2 teenagers with nothing to do and turned their boredom into muscle. On an upturned hull she chalked a sketch that looked like a jellyfish fell in love with a harpoon. We stitch waves, she told them, tapping the page. Not kill them. We draw a line through T. He bad shape and hand the good half to Tamari when she needs it. Will it work? One boy asked, eager to doubt where doubting didn't get you yelled at. I absolutely don't know, Tenton said. That's what makes it fun. Karen took the ledger of the village and turned it into a map only she could read. She tasted the air and wrote in the margins, Tizuna's crew East Jetty grave, tired old Akis. Cousins. Won't leave unless someone mentions dogs. Kiyomi 6 keeps running back for a toy boat. She made boxes, 10 by 10, then to the horizon, and signed a little Karen at the corner of each. People, E took it like you take a stranger's hand when it's the only one extended. Hinata tied her hair back with a string and slid over the side of the pier without fanfare. 2 fishermen blinked at her small LNESS and the way the water did not resist her. She had a rope tied around her waist because Tizuna's daughter insisted and because arrogance was for men who hadn't seen Undertow. In 3 breaths she was a pale shadow under the pilings. Fingers reading seals left there by men who had pretended to be repairing stone. She tapped with gentle palm strikes, and seals that had been slick and smug forgot how to hum. The rope twitched twice. She slackened it so the men topside wouldn't yank too early. She came up once for air, blew water out of her nose without embarrassment, and went back down, because drowning makes a poor story. Naruto stood at the head of the causeway and watched the sky collapse inwards. The first long bands of rain hit like thrown ropes. Out beyond the harbor mouth, a wave lifted its shoulders. He found Tamari along the breakwater, hair already a wet snarl, grin already practiced. She looked at the white of his bandage and said nothing. He liked her for that. You ready? She asked. Always, he said. They ran the wall together. At each kiln vent Tenten's boys had bolted to the stone. Naruto breathed into the head of the spear the way a glassblower breathes when he loves his work. Tamari bent the vented heat with small flicks, sending it out in swaths like painter's primer, just enough warmth to make the wind remember how to curl instead of claw. The barrier Shion, laid lit as the first kiss of real wave crossed it. The bells jangled. The sea sulked. Left angle. Tamari snapped at one vent. It's catching. Again. Good. Next. Karen's voice came over the chaos like she was standing in Naruto's other ear. North boxes 12 through 16 just got ugly. 2 boats flipped. A third pretending. I've got it. A clone said that was already leaping, and he did. People didn't panic. They nearly did. Then checked. Then kept moving. Then a section of the causeway, older stone patched 12 times with whatever was handy, twitched under the weight of too many feet. It made a low, animal sound and lurched. Someone screamed the way sheep do when the first one falls. Naruto didn't think. He put himself in the exact middle and burned a word. Still, he said, it was small. It didn't go far, but it went. The panic stopped like a competently run play. The herd of feet, the tilt of bodies, the mindless run that pushes children down, halted. It wasn't paralysis. It was a held breath. He saw faces in that breath. Tizuna's boy's boy with his mouth open, the angry aunt with a pot in her hand she refused to drop, the dog underfoot who was about to become a mistake. And he made room in the word for each of them. The stone finished its lurch and stillness kept it from turning into a stampede. Shion's bell line hummed as if in approval. Naruto's voice tore a little. He tasted iron. He swallowed and the swallow made his eyes sting. He did not speak again for a time because he liked being able to speak at all. They crossed that stretch without anyone going into the water who hadn't intended to. Show off, Tamari said, breath gone, admiration tucked behind sarcasm where she liked it. She saw the bandage darken at the corner and didn't say don't. She said, save that for when I deserve it. Hinata came up beside them, breathless in the right way. South anchor is quiet, she said. East is being stubborn. Then we'll make it somebody else's problem, Tamari said. Naruto, ready to be stupid in the sky. He grinned, then remembered the cost and nodded instead. The wall stood ahead, the shoulder of the storm thickening. Beyond it the world was white and gray and occasional knives of light. Tamari opened the air and made a corridor through the first lash of rain. Naruto ran into it and breathed out a line. Wind and heat met and neither one. They braided. A corridor sketched itself through water not meant to be walked through. They went into the eye wall like two idiots who had decided idiocy deserved finesse. Steam rose, turning the world into paw. La smoke shot through with the flash of lightning. Left, Tamari barked, turning them a degree with a fan flick only she could make count for that much. Ahead, down, no, up, now. They cleared the wall. The eye wasn't calm, it was merely different. Rain bit from strange angles. The sea inside the ring made long, leashed shapes that wanted to bolt when the chain loosened. In the middle of that arena, a lighthouse that had been decommissioned before Naruto had been born stood up like a witness. It thrummed with the wrong hum. Godspear, Tenten said into his ear because she'd climbed the inside of the tower while no one was watching her do it. 3 anchors and a lie. Hinata was already sliding along the lower jetty, hands touching sigils that had been etched where barnacles usually lived. She cut one. The tower brightened. The hum sharpened. It noticed, she said flatly. Cut 2 more and it'll sulk, Tenten said. Then we harpoon what's left and Tamari throws it a party elsewhere. Naruto landed on the ruins of a breaker and rolled to a crouch as the next stitch of lightning took a chunk of air and turned it into a lesson. Karen's voice reached him again, tighter. Mantle units on the lighthouse galleries, she said. 2 with rifles that eat chakra, 1 with a box I hate. Naruto, your throat reads red. Don't. He laughed without sound and then had to swallow because even laughing hurt. He tapped the side of his neck with 2 fingers like a promise. White Mantle stepped into their story the way they liked. Efficient, arrogant, steady. One lifted the box like an offering. It unfolded into something that didn't look like a weapon until the first note came out, low and bored and hateful. The air around Naruto's clones went grainy. 3 popped like embers underwater without even getting their good quips off. Hinata vanished under a wave's lip and came up inside a gap in the gallery rung. She hit a seal and the box hiccuped. Tenten, 3 levels above her, tossed a metal bird and it stuck to the box with glue that had opinions. She didn't look to see if it would annoy, she trusted her own wickedness. Need that anchor, Shion called from the harbor, wind shred, ing her voice into a line he still caught. The belt holds, but it's sulking. Naruto made 2 more clones and sent them where he would have gone himself if the mathematics of throats had been kinder. One dove to haul an old woman off a half-collapsed catwalk and got a kiss on the helmet that made him grin and then pop when a dart took him in the shoulder. The other joined Tezuna's people at the end line where a boat full of fools tried to turn foolhardy into volunteering. Karen's voice again, like a string around his wrist, west. 2 towers lighting up, they're triangulating you and, hold on, someone else. Lightning measured the space above the eye and set a stare in it. A familiar figure took the second step like gravity existed at his pleasure. Daichi wore rain like a well-cut coat, he didn't blink it out of his eyes. He looked at the lighthouse, at the necklaces of nets, at the harbor line of bells, at Naruto's spear, and let something like satisfaction register. Not for the storm, for the way the people under it held. Naruto, he said, weather made the syllables crisp. Let's get this done before the mantle decides to measure us again. I'm a little busy, Naruto said, He words sounded like broken glass in his throat. He coughed and hated himself for doing it. Hinata's gaze flicked back. Saw him, saw the choice, let him keep it. Daichi took 1 step down so they cool. Talk without shouting and it could feel like a conversation between men who had chosen to make rain into something else. You turn disasters into committees, he said, without scorn. People into people, Naruto said. Daichi's mouth acknowledged that. I will redirect the wall when you break the 3rd anchor, he said. If you fail, I take command. Total command. The mantle will get neither of us today. Naruto spat pink into the rain and tasted oaths. You can help without owning, he said. Daichi tilted his head. We'll see. Hinata's palms struck. The 2nd anchor cut with a sound like a nail being pulled out of an old board. The lighthouse hummed itself an offended little song. Tenten pivoted on the stairwell and threw herself across a gap to reach the 3rd anchor plate. The wind it for 2 beats and tried to make the city forget she was real. She grinned because she liked arguments, and drove the tip of a knife between 2 characters on the seal and twisted like she meant it. The anchor did not like being told no. It died anyway. Now, Tenten yelled. Naruto planted the spear and breathed down it steady as he could without opening the scratch wider. Heat ran. The gyro ring sang. He aimed the exhale not at people and not even at the metal. at the shape of the net the anchors had left behind, the fragile geometry of a triangle missing a corner. Temuri's wind took his line and pulled it into a ribbon. Then a thread, then a seam. The seam cut the net's wrongness and the net collapsed like a shirt badly folded. Above, Daichi turned the wall of rain with a sweep of his arm that had less to do with muscle than with intent. The storm obeyed him the way dogs obey men who never yell, the way it resists because that's its nature and then gives because the hand on its collar has weight that isn't threat. The eye face changed. The ring loosened. Got one, Karen breathed. 1.5, the northern pair still hot. 2 towers inland buzzing like a beehive knocked with a stick. You've made them nervous. Finish the east pair, Tamari said, eyes already mapping. Then we ripped their beehive. The world agreed in the way it does when plans fit into the grooves luck carved when no one was watching. Tenton braced the harpoon on the bow of a fishing smack and fired it into a wave crest like she was skewering a rude guest. The line played out. The gyro shrieked and then settled into the kind of hum that makes craftsmen close their eyes involuntarily. The wave hit the line and forgot how to stand. It lay down long enough for 2 boats to cross the mouth and for a chill. D's had to skip from one curl to the next instead of under. An old woman on the breakwater flung her arms up and whooped because respect for weather doesn't mean you don't get to enjoy it when it gives you a seat. Hinata surfaced, hair slicked to her face, eyes calm, mouth steady. 3, she said. We have a window. Take it, Naruto rasped. He caught himself on the railing when the cough hit because pride had already had his day. Daichi looked down and saw the bandage go darker. He did not smile. He did not pity. He took in data. You should allow me to take the rest, he said. You've spent the tool. Naruto wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. It's not a tool, he said. It's mine. Then treat it like yours, Daichi said, lightning stepping from one shoulder to the other like a hawk changing perches. He looked beyond Naruto to the north. The mantle are about to switch on their array and we will both dislike it. He was right because that was the habit he made in the world. North along the coast, new lights woke in old towers. They linked up invisibly and drew their triangle through air and rain and the precise, cold mathematics of people who believe enough in neat diog rams that they think the diagram will make people behave. The hum at the base of Naruto's skull became a taste like bidden coin. On me, he shouted, and the word tore something he couldn't afford to let tear. Pain went hot and then very cold along the center of his throat. The air made a sound like apology where it hit him. Hinata was already in motion, hand on the back of his neck, pressure point under his ear. A touch that told the body hold without asking and got obedience because it was spoken in a language the body trusted. He drank a breath like a fugitive. He nodded. His voice went back in its box. For now, array nodes, Karen said, fingers tapping compulsive time on her leg. Roofs and lighthouses and the old relay station on the north bluff. If we cut any one, the others flex. Cut 3. The geometry sulks and collapses. They're aiming at you and at our friend in the coat. Daichi did not look offended. He looked bored with being predictable to men in white masks. We split, Tamari said. Naruto, go with Hinata and break the bluff. I'll scissor the northern pair if Tenton pins the wave long enough for me to stand up there without learning to swim. Shion, I'll keep the belt, Shion said calmly. As bells rang against rope and salt steadied ropes that did not want to hold. If anyone thinks about running where they shouldn't, I will disagree with them. The bluff toe, wore ivy and negligence and a crisp new plate of iron disguised as a door. Naruto put his hand to it and felt the hum through his bones. Hinata pressed her fingers to the edge and slipped steel into old mortar. The door decided it had always wanted to oblige like this and swung in. Inside, coils and wiring and careful math. Seals inscribed along beams. A tripod anchored in the bedrock with thray. E-bolts carved with characters that leaned legal. 3 white mantle technicians looked up with the guilty decency of men whose shame had just been invited to a better party and decided to attend. Leave, Hinata said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She put the respect in the word the way you put tea on a table for someone you want to stay, and the men understood that they did not deserve to be stayed for. They took their shame and their legs and used both. Naruto knelt by the tripod. He didn't speak. He let his fingers read the divots the bolts made in the rock. He set the S. Peer down and felt the gyro ring hum sympathetically with the array. Two singing forks, one older than the other. He brought the ring closer. The array's note wobbled. Hinata leaned in, breath steady. Cut here, she whispered. And tapped the base where 3 lines met. If you cut the leg, it compensates. If you cut the meeting, it doesn't know which leg it is. He breathed through his teeth, laid the blade in, and sliced cleanly. The array squealed like a spoiled instrument, then went quiet. The hum in his own bones changed key. 2 left, Karen said in his ear. It wasn't magic. It was a woman with a talent and a map. Tamari took those 2 because she liked turning bad math into better air. She climbed the north pair with wind under her feet and irritation under her tongue. Mantle shoot. Urs tried to pick her off and discovered that the difference between moving air and moved air is whether you wanted to hit. She touched the plates on the towers with the tips of her fingers and erased the last character on 2 long strings of characters that had been written by men who didn't believe the last character in any string matters. The array died like a brag that no one clapped for. For a still, stunned heartbeat the storm stopped trying to be a machine. It was only a storm. Daichi took that beat and bent the eye away from the harbor with a long, controlled gesture. It cost him, Naru, to saw the edges of the cost in the lines of his jaw and the precise way he set his shoulders. They were men with different margins for pain. They both paid. Harpoon, Tenten yelled, stitching. She threw it into a wave that had ideas. The line took the idea and told it to behave. The wave split around the mouth of the harbor instead of into it. Boats slid through the seam like knives through cured fish. 2 children clapped because the rope had made the water make a silly shape. Bells rang in approval and exhaustion. The belt Sheehan had drawn held even as it got scuffed by debris and prayer. Slips washed soggy and then decided they could keep being prayers anyway. Her hands shook once. She put them flat on the stone and the stone did what she asked because she had been asking politely for hours. One more blow to the causeway and it would have gone. Naruto sent 10 clones and then sent himself because there's a kind of leader who will forgive you for not showing up if you show results. And he had never successfully tricked himself into being that kind. He reached the failing section as 100 people tried to be on 1 square of stone at once. The world bucked. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. He grabbed the front of the line and heaved, and on the back of the line someone understood and heaved too, and then 50 someones and then 100, and suddenly they were not a crowd anymore but a rope. The slab dropped into whitewater and everyone on the far side didn't. They were over. It had been very close without feeling dramatic at the time, the way good rescue work is. He storm fought them until it got bored of losing the same argument. It moved out, bruised. The waves grew honest instead of ambitious. The towers hummed themselves into sullen silence. Naruto and Kai ended up on the same piece of wet stone on a lighthouse that ought to be condemned, and laughed once in the same breath. It was ridiculous and honest. Lightning crawled along the horizon, more commentary than threat now. You refused the duel, Daichi said, not accusing. I had better work, Naruto said. Daichi nodded like a craftsman checking a seam. He studied the belt of rope and bells around the harbor. He studied the way the village stood up instead of scattering. He studied the spear on Naruto's shoulder that hummed like a mouth closed on a song. This is not poor, he said, which from him was nearly a hymn. Say you're impressed again, Tenten called from below, cupping her hands around her mouth with no respect for divine-level conversations. I want to make a stencil. Daichi's eyes stayed on Naruto. You have argued well, he said. I am not persuaded, yet, but I am entertained. Try being moved, Naruto said, too tired to aim for witty. I was, Daichi said, with that dry look of his. Which is why I didn't break your causeway to prove a point. Naruto lifted a brow. That's going in the minutes, he rasped. Daichi looked out to sea again, as if the storm had writ him a letter and he was composing the kind response. The mantle will adapt, he said. They'll try to pin both of us with something less elegant than what we saw today. You should learn how to cut. Not just anchors but the idea of anchors. We will, Naruto said. You already are, Daichi corrected, almost amused. Today you made mercy efficient. I respect that. He stepped onto a low plank of bright air. Lightning tamed into a boardwalk, and lifted 2 fingers in farewell to Hinata, to Tamari, to Tenten, to Shion, the way a general acknowledges other generals he isn't trying to kill yet. Watch your voice, he said to Naruto without turning. You won't like what it asks you to pay if you treat it like coin. Then he was gone, the stare of light folding behind him neat as napkins. They named the dead that night and the not dead and the lucky. Wave people drank quietly and loudly at the same time. Shion's line sagged in places and people retied it as if the string were veins. Tazuna told anyone who would listen that he'd known Naruto when his hair had less sense and his mouth had more. Naruto sat on the edge of a dock with his legs dangling above black water and a throat that fell. Like he'd swallowed a handful of shells. Hinata's hand cupped the back of his neck and her thumb found the place that let the pain be the right shape instead of the kind that made you useless. He leaned into her touch without theater. You shouldn't have used it, she said, not scolding, just referencing the law of conservation of Naruto's. I think fewer people die because I did, he said, mouth crooked. I can live with costing myself a day. You'll live with costing yourself too if you keep justifying it like that, she said, but the kiss she pressed to his cheek argued gently. Tenten flow. PPED down on the pier beside them with the grace of a person whose joints have temporarily left. She set the harpoon across her knees and polished the ring with a rag until it hummed the smug little hum she loved. We stitched a wave, she said, proud the way pride should be. No one stopped me from naming it. Karen sat cross-legged on a coil of rope, her messy hair a halo gone scandalous. She fanned herself with a piece of the mantle's paperwork she'd stolen for the joy of it. We also stole their radio net for an hour, she said around a mouthful of rice ball. Did I mention? I ate their orders out of the air. They tasted like cheap incense and no wives. Tamari walked up slow, a cup of something warm in each hand, wind must and utterly herself. She handed one to Naruto and one to Hinata, and leaned her shoulders back until her spine popped like victory. Half the array's down, she reported, almost conversational. I want the rest off this coast by week's end. I'll send a request to every village for men and scorn. Tenten will send invoices, Naruto murmured. I'll put philanthropy tax at the top, Tenten said. That always makes rich men cry, and rich men crying oils the gears. Shion came by with a bowl of broth and a stack of new prayer slips that smelled like ink that had opinions. She took in Naruto's raw voice and Temari's hair and Tenten's stole bird grin and Hinata's careful thumb and Karen's feral contentment, and she smiled. You did good, she said, which sometimes was the only right that mattered. Naruto took the broth. It hurt to swallow and hurt less by the next swallow. Which is how you know you're getting better. He stared out where the storm had turned its face away and thought about the shape of the choice he'd made, how the voice worked when he made it small enough to fit into real lives and not big enough to turn people into furniture. He thought about Daichi, who would be the easiest man in the world to hate if hating him didn't make you lazy. He thought about White Mantle Towers ticking away like polite bombs. Tazuna dropped down beside him in a knee creak of solidarity. You did good, he said, copying Shion, and then, because he was Taz. Una and could not leave a praise uncluttered. You also look like a fish chewed you and spat you out for being too spicy. Honored, Naruto croaked. Don't make jokes that hurt, Hinata warned, which made Tazuna chuckle in a way that turned into a cough he pretended was a laugh. The night settled not like peace but like a sensible shoulder over people who had earned their sleep. The bells around the harbor chimed less often. Nets hung from beams in elegant size. The sea lapped like someone apologizing for their earlier behavior and meaning it just enough. Later, when the cups were empty and the quick checklists done and the walking wounded lay down to try their luck at rest, Naruto stood, not gracefully, and made a slow circuit of the belt with Shion. He carried the salt. She carried the string. Mercy is a weapon, she said after they'd tied the last knot. Not a question, unnoticing. It's sharp, he said. So is your throat, she said. You keep using it like a blade, it will demon. You let it cut something you don't want to lose. He thought of the causeway breath. He thought of children holding pots and dogs forgetting fear. I know, he said. Good, she said. Knowing is only the first step. The second is choosing anyway. The third is stopping when the price is wrong. He could not promise he'd always manage the third. He could promise he'd have the argument with himself honestly. He reached out and flicked a prayer slip where it hung wet and stubborn. It flicked back, unimpressed by his philosophy and very impressed by the knot. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. Dawn came up with eyes like a boxer, swollen and proud. The sea lay flat as if it had decided to be good today to pay for yesterday. The towers that had hummed with bad intention were quiet. Men climbed them with tools that had nothing to do with magic and took them apart with crowbars and spite. Tenton supervised and stole a coil of wire and later returned it with an apology and a replacement better than the original. Karen slept for 4 hours and woke with ink on her cheek and a map of the array in her head like a song. Hinata moved through the hospital row murmuring gentlins over people who had had too much storm in them. Tamari wrote letters that were not requests so much as instructions delivered at range. Shion taught 3 children how to tie a proper salt knot, and each time they did it right they looked taller. Naruto watched Wave return to itself and let his voice rest. When he did finally test it on a thank you to a woman who had handed him a bowl of rice pho. Free because she liked the shape of his grin and because she was awake to who had done work that night, it didn't tear. It rasped. It promised to forgive him if he didn't try to be a poet before lunch. On the long dock where the wind liked to sit, Daichi had left a neat scorch mark, 3 steps and an absence. Naruto looked at it for a quiet minute, hand on the spear, heat quiet in his bones, and then turned away to help carry lumber because saving people wasn't a crown. It was weight you spread out by giving everyone a hand on the beam. They stayed in Wave 3 days to make being gone feel less like running. They fixed roofs. They replaced a causeway slab with something that deserved to be believed in. They tore down the mantel plates and wired the metal into crab pots because weather has a sense of humor if you're brave enough to see it. Then they left with bundles of fish cakes and a new swear from Tazuna and a line in the air that said next time we will not need you and meant we hope. The road back had less rain and more talk. Tenton walked backward for an hour while telling a story about a knife that had insulted her and paid for it. Karen hid a yawn that turned into a laugh. That turned into an argument with a bird about who owned a piece of twine. Shion picked herbs from the ditch and made a tea that tasted like a lecture and worked like a promise. Hinata set her hand on Naruto's arm when he tried to say something dumb in a nice way and he let her speak for him because that's what trust looked like when you were tired. They reached the first ridge where the sea became a rumor again and stopped to look back, because you always do if you've made a place a little safer. The wind off the water smelled like clean wood and the ends of ropes. In the far distance, 2 of the old towers lay on their sides like men sleeping off guilt. Half down, Tamari had said. The rest soon. Naruto nodded to the horizon like it was a person. We'll keep choosing, he said, and his voice didn't break. Far inland, men in white masks unrolled a map with new red strings and a director tapped a finger where 3 deserts met and wrote, primary siphon site in blocking hand that tried too hard to be calm. On a storm that had turned its face toward some other poor coastline, Daichi stood on a little platform of nothing and watched the compass needle of his intentions swing. He did not smile. He did not frown. He took a breath and made a note. He saved them without me. Good. Now show him where that ends. Naruto and his people walked into trees. The sea growled behind them and then purred, out of trouble for a day. The bells at the harbor line sounded once, twice, then quiet. He rolled his shoulders, let the bandage sit, and saved his voice for the work ahead. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. Crown of Scales. The desert remembered him. It wasn't superstition so much as the way wind traced old paths when it thought no one was looking. Naruto stood on a dune under a sky hammered thin by heat and watched a line of white tents sprout where Roran had once been a city that made glass sing. The tents were tidy in the way theater is tidy, ropes geometric, stakes disciplined, and ordered. That wanted to convince you it had a right to be here. It grew, Tamari said beside him, shading her eyes with 2 fingers. 3 rings of perimeter where there were 2. They've been hauling gear for a week at least. See the shine. Naruto saw it. Metal ridges where there should have been canvas. Siphon lattice, he said. They finished building a polite bomb. Tenton lay on her stomach between them. Binoculars upside down because she'd already looked and now she was being perverse. 4 towers. 1 at each corner of stupid. If I were a person with bad taste, I'd anchor a siphon there. ND hum it like a lullaby until it ate the vein's edges. Director, Karen murmured, head tilted like a fox catching wind. The late light sharpened the red in her hair. He's here. Not the field captain from Suna. The one who chewed the budget until it cried. He moves 2 tenths back of center. The orders around him are the kind that don't get written down. He tastes like clean ink and lemon oil and contempt for anyone who whispers. Sheehan knelt on the sand with a roll of linen across her knees, not looking at the tents at all, but at the way the air lay over the ground like a sheet. They put fences in the wind, she said quietly. You can tell when you ask it to cross and it tells you to wait for permission. Hinata scanned, Byakugan opening like dawn. Veins of chakra in the ground brightened under her gaze. Thin to thick to incandescent where they converged under the old heart of the city. She exhaled. The lattice touches the vein at 12 points. The seal work is static until they sing it awake. If they do, the dragon vein will stop being what it is and become everything they want it to be. Naruto drank the silence like a man who intended to use it up. He could feel the heat in his bones like an animal shifting in a den, alert without strain. His throat was healed enough to let him trust a word or 3. He didn't intend to spend more than he needed. All right, he said. We do 3 things at once. And we do them faster than their report writing. Temari's mouth did that satisfied little hook it did when a plan knew its own center of gravity. Say it, Temari, he said, peel their units off the lattice. Sandstorms, fake convoys, a couple of messages they can't ignore drawn in the ground. I want their outer ring thinking about the wrong direction for an hour. She nodded, already calculating wind directions and how to throw grit where it hurt arrogance most. I'll make them suspect each other's competence, she said, as if promising a favor. Tenten, Naruto continued, turning. Your spear becomes a conduit. Ground their dead man runes into the glass under the lattice instead of into us. If they try to fail safely, make sure they actually do. Tenten grinned like a blasphemy. We'll need 2 bus bars and something that won't melt when it meets bad ideas. Give me an hour and a place to swear. Karen, he said, you cut the string. Find the director, read the breath between his orders. And sever comms. If they can't shout, all that tidy falls apart. Karen's smile showed just enough teeth to count. He's already annoying me. This will be therapeutic. Sheehan, Naruto said, you perform the right. Anchor the shard's promise at the heart of the vein so the lattice, if it wakes into a purpose we set. You'll need witnesses. We'll be your chorus. Her gaze warmed without softening. Consent is a shape. I'll draw it. She looked at Hinata and Naruto both. You 2 bring me to the door. I'll knock. You'll open. Hinata's hand brushed Naruto's sleeve. A light touch that said I'm here and also you do not get to carry this alone. I can thread their seals, she said. The lattice is clever, but it shows corners anyone with eyes can find. And Daichi? Temari asked, not bothering to pretend he wasn't the 3rd center of the map. He'll come, Naruto said simply. We'll give him better choices than the ones he's practiced. Temari rolled her shoulders. I'll keep his hands full until you want them empty. Don't break him, Tenten added, too casually to be entirely teasing. I'll try, Naruto said, which made Karen snort once. Honest man, annoying promise. He knelt and drew the simplest map he could in the sand. Rings, towers, a lozenge where the siphon lattice kissed the vein. He laid pebbles for each of them. When he reached for one for himself, Hinata's finger was there first, steadying. He left it. The first move happened at sunset because some fights want an audience of shadows. Temari lifted her fan and the desert stood up. Not a wall. She wasn't a fool, but a procession of hustling ghosts. Sand lifted in lines and fell again in waves that looked like men moving in numbers. White Mantle scouts saw what their training wanted to see. A flanking force setting to test their perimeter. The perimeter turned where Temari wanted it to turn. Runners sprinted in a direction that mattered less than their absence. Naruto watched, head the outer ring thin and felt the plan's first click. He looked aside and found Hinata already headed for the gap, shin high, cloak tied short, mouth shaped like focus and kindness. He followed. Tenten and Karen went the other way. Hunters in the bright dark. They slid into the ruins' ribs while wind beat at canvas behind them and white tents adjusted like an animal chasing a flea. The Hushta, T had always sat inside Roran was still there, under the new hum, loyal to stone more than to men. Hinata pointed once, a tiny motion of 2 fingers, and Naruto stepped over a line of faint characters T. Hat would have turned his bones into friendly chalk. He put his hand on the same wall she had just touched so he could learn the feel of it the way he liked learning, on the palms. Karen ghosted through a gap on the north side with Tenten in her slipstream. She put 2 fingers to her temple and sniffed a current like a chef guessing spices with her eyes shut. Left, she whispered, under the lab. A faint smile. He doesn't call it that. He calls it a field solution. He's in love with his own nouns. Tenten arched a brow without slowing. I have a cure for that, she said. It involves verbs. They found him in a pit that had once been a bath, now lined in canvas and hum. He was younger than his voice had claimed days ago, or older in a way that wasn't about years. His mask lay on the table. His mouth was thin enough to make the mask look kind in retrospect. He didn't look up when Carrie N slid into the room. His eyes were on 3 needles moving along a paper roll, recording tremors in lines like a nervous heartbeat. Director, Karen said, all sugar and razors. He turned, offended by the presence of the world. This is a restricted. Tenten's metal bird hit the corner of the table and unfolded into a ridiculous parasol, shivering down confetti that stuck to the controls with glue that had opinions. Karen stood with her hands behind her back like a student, head cocked in empathy. And then reached out and touched the air beside the director's shoulder. Quiet, she said, not to him. To the web of signals around him. The web took the command because it had been trained to take orders spoken with a certain savor, and Karen had stolen that tone just long enough to spit poison back down the pipe it came from. The paper needles stuttered, stopped, then stalled flat. The director, Ashina, Karen decided. Because that's how his men had thought of him when they tried not to, didn't lunge or bluster. He reached for a hinged case under the table and snapped it open on a seal tube. Tenten kicked the tube's latch while saying, no, in a voice that would have made a lesser person cry. The latch broke. The tube told itself it had always intended to be a pencil cup. Obnoxious, Director Ashina noted. Almost admiring. Flattered, Tenten said, leave. Or stay and watch the good version of your idea. Karen's palm landed light on the director's chest, over the sternum, exactly the place you tap a heel to test a plank. He's thinking about the dead man, she said flatly. He's already given the order in his head. It's pre-written. He just needs to mouth it. Tenten's grin went knife bright. Let him. But not here. They left him with the parasol shedding celebratory paper and hurry in his breath with nowhere useful to go. Outside, the first ripples hit the lattice, Temeri's erase and rewrite wind. Naruto's pressure at the weak seam struts, Hinata's taps on the joint sigils that told the structure to mistrust itself. In the old heart chamber, where glass had cooled into curves nobody sane would engineer, Shion unrolled her linen on the floor that was not floor, hands steady and deliberate. Witness me, she said, not loud, not humble, just the tone of a person asking a room to sit up straight. She nodded to the citizens Tamari had reluctantly let through the cordon, stonecutters, a runner girl with ink still staining her fingers, an old woman from edge of the ruin whose son had died the year the city gave up on being a city and yet who had come anyway because someone should be here to say when enough was enough. A handful of Suna shinobi stood inside the arch by Temeri's order. Not to own, to watch. Hinata and Naruto stepped into the chamber like divers into water that had been waiting for them. It wasn't that it wanted them. It knew them. The way a room knows the weight it's used to. The vein pulsed. Not visible, not audible, but undeniable. The siphon lattice's kiss on its skin recorded as a wrongness you could taste. It would wake to whatever spoke loudest. That was the terror. That was the hope. Breathe with me, Hinata said softly. She took his wrist and laid his palm over hers, the old touch from training days that meant hold there and not a fraction to the left. There, she said, and he found the rhythm she saw in her eyes trailing into the stone. Shion lifted a cup, earthen, ordinary. She poured water from a skin alon. The inner ring of the chamber in a slow circle and set her voice to work like a hand. Roran's heart, she said, you are not meat. You are not coin. You are not a song a man can buy by singing it louder. You have a duty. Be a river. We'll give you a bank. The lattice shivered in the walls. Hinata's fingers dug into Naruto's wrist once, hard, then eased. He breathed with her until his heat wanted out and then he let it leak, not gush. Not even flow, just enough for Stone to know it had been recognized. Tamari, Naruto said into the bead at his collarbone. Busy, Tamari said in his ear. She sounded pleased and contemptuous in equal measure, which meant somebody in white was currently switching orders twice a minute trying to cope with the wrong enemy. North ring peeled, south ring jealous. Daichi's weather is an hour out if it keeps its manners. Karen, director is muzzled, Karen said, breath warm in the line. He'll go for his fail-safe when he thinks the math is pretty. I'm going to move pretty. Tenten, Naruto said, conduit humming, she replied. This will either save our lives or make the prettiest glass grave anyone's ever seen. Optimist, Hinata murmured, her mouth curving the way it did when someone else's audacity delighted her. They reached the core. It didn't look like a core if you'd been raised on diagrams. It looked like a subcurrent under a subcurrent, a rush of pressure under an old scar. A shape only your hands could understand when you pressed them to the floor and the floor agreed to be read. Naruto set his hands. Hinata set hers over them. Her wreath on his knuckles steadied what ached in him, and something in him that had never needed permission from any god decided to be gentler for once. He was so aware of the voice in his throat that it felt like a knife he wasn't touching. He didn't plan to use it here. He planned to let it be the threat he didn't make. The first tremor came from above, the lattice groaning awake as if it had dreamed of being a canopy and found itself a trap instead. The floor brightened at 12 points like stars someone thought would look better in a grid. Xian's circle of water gleamed. The witnesses, Breet, shortened as if their ribs had heard an order and obeyed. Right, Xian said, simple as telling water to boil. She laid the saffron cloth at the center of the circle and placed the earthen cup on it. She pricked her finger with a sliver of glass and let a single drop strike the water. By consent, she said. By witnesses. By work. We call this power to hold, not to hunt. The lattice resisted, not with intelligence, with momentum. It wanted the old way. Sealed commands shouted into it by men who liked measured things because breath made them nervous. Naruto felt the wrongness tick his palms. He could turn it. He knew he could. The voice sat in him like a coiled spring saying all you have to do is let go. Don't, Hinata said, without looking at him, because she could feel the hunger in his fingers. Not yet, he nodded, and the nod cost more than the 100 times he'd said now this month. He breathed instead, line thin, careful, letting the heat run down his arms into the stone, not hot enough to burn. Warm enough to make glass remember it had once been water. Above them, outside, under a sky that was not paying attention to individual men because it had found a more interesting argument to have with another man entirely. Tamari leaned into the wind and smiled a little because hate made you sloppy and she was in love with her job. She'd drawn 3 false convoys with Banner S and had watched 2 mantle squads chase the third with the complicated sincerity of people who had forgotten to bring humor. She wrote you left your back door open in a script only aerial scouts WOU. LD read and then flipped it with a gust so the message changed to her using IT and then lifted her fan and sent a wall of grit into the teeth of a unit trying to stand their ground. She respected them. She dirtied their boots anyway. Karen found the fail-safe node where Director Ashina had tucked it under a dignity of linen. She laughed once, a private sound. You wanted this to be elegant, she said, not admiring. Your mistake was thinking elegance is something you get to order. She touched the line of characters that told the energy where to run when the man in charge panicked, and she bent that line half an inch to the left. It didn't take much. It never does when a system is tight enough that tolerance matters. The dead man would still fire. But it would find a tourniquet, not a throat. Tenten crouched under the spine of a fallen arch and bolted the last busbar into the black steel mouth of the spear she had built for a different war and was now making help her win this one. The Euro ring thrummed. It would hold, probably, which from Tenten was an almost religious assurance. If you behave, she told the metal, I will buy you a drink. Daichi arrived with the first polite roan of thunder and the kind of lightning that doesn't apologize for loving a line. He didn't come alone. He came as the visible edge of a system, the storm devourer's presence so subtle the hair on Our arms didn't know whether to rise or fall. He stepped off a stitched seam of light and took in the rings, the tents, the grid moving in intentional eddies, the girl on the ridge riding speed into wind. And the bright center of wrongness underneath where a boy, no, a man, was about to try to teach a very old thing a better way to be old. You make the world enjoy itself, Daichi said when he reached Temari's flank. And it wasn't a joke. Move, not your general, Temari said without heat. She stepped anyway, not to obey, to set a better angle. If you break something I like, I am writing your name on a list. Which one? He asked, curious. The polite one, she said, and sent grit into the eyes of a man about to misunderstand a grenade. Daichi walked through men getting ready to die for an outline and didn't insult them by pretending not to see them. He dropped off the ridge. Lightning burned through the outside lattice and wound itself around his arm like a bandage. He shut off THR-EE towers like a man switching off a rainfall in a room. You have had my warning, he murmured to the air, perhaps to the mantle, perhaps to fate. Now take the lesson. Below, the heart chamber bucked. The lattice had woken itself without orders because momentum is a kind of tyrant. Lines lit. The room took on that dry, dead feeling of sealed rooms built by people who mistrust breath. Xian's circle held. The water shook with the tremor and did not spill. The witnesses leaned forward at once, because it is a human thing to think closeness makes complicity better. Xian smiled to herself at T. Hatton said the name she had written with them, the one they had agreed on without owning. Keep. The vein listened. It did not obey. It did what old powers do when they are addressed as equals. It paused. In the pause you could fit a city. Now, Hinata said, and Naruto understood what she was asking, not words. Intention. He let the heat in him speak in the only grammar it had ever trusted, pressure on work. He breathed into the seam under his hands and the seam softened. Above them, Director Ashina, not a fool, not brave, just committed, broke his parasol of confetti and slammed his palm into a rune so unwilling to be used for this that it flared with resentment. The dead man sang. It didn't go where he wanted. Karen's half-inch bent it into the conduit Naruto had begged Tenten to give him. The black steel mouth drank heat like a saint drinks water after a fast. The bus bars took it and sent it into the sand where it wanted to turn into glass. It did. The shock ran down into the earth and carved a vein of green glass through the ruin, the kind of terrible beautiful wound the desert will keep forever. Tenten crowed once, in decorous joy. Good girl, she told the ring, patting it like a horse. Naruto felt the shock arrive skimmed and tamed. He left his hands where they were and told his body to be a conductor, not a fuse. The heat passed through him into the floor and ran into Shio. N's word and found it opposed exactly as much as needed. Not more. He felt his throat flex, wanting to speak. He chose not to. The choice cost him, and he paid it, because he had learned which currencies the desert accepted. The mantle, to their credit, did not break and run. They did the thing men with training do when training suddenly doesn't apply. They formed a new square. It would have been impressive if it hadn't been pointed at people who were busy saving them from themselves. Daichi's presence pressed at the edge of the room like whether considering coming inside for a drink. He didn't force it, he waited, which was its own skill. Xian's right moved from asking to binding. Not a chain, a cord. You can leave, she told the power, and the witnesses heard the shape of leave as, be wild, and, be gone, and also, be free. Then she said, you can stay, and they heard the shape of stay as, be held to a purpose you chose when you were first named city. The vein answered in pressure. Hinata's eyes stung. Naruto tasted steam. The cloth on the floor fluttered once, as if something had walked by. Director, Karen said into a bead that was not connected to his ear and therefore Old not answer even if he didn't hate being told he had failed. You're about to lose men who don't deserve to die for your diagram. Call them off. He did not. Pride is a shape that knows itself. He pulled another rune. He would have thought of himself as the necessary villain if he had believed in stories with villains. He believed in instruments and budgets and acceptable costs. Lightning touched the outer ring. Daichi stepped through it without drama, and suddenly there he was in the mouth of the heart chamber, hands at his back, eyes on Naruto with that patient infuriating recognition. He took in Shien's circle and Hinata's wrists and Naruto's hands and the way the room held its breath for him. Uzumaki, he said, you are about to do something irrevocable. Good, so am I. Stop, Tamari said from the arch behind him. Her fan rested against her shoulder but not in a way that meant she would forget how to pick it up. No duels. Not here. Agreed, Daichi said. His eyes did not leave Naruto. But we will finish our argument in the same paragraph. Paragraphs are my specialty, Tenten called cheerfully from the far corridor. I can punctuate with explosions. Don't, Hinata said, not even turning. And Tenten snapped a lazy salute Hinata somehow saw and approved with the lift of the corner of her mouth. Daichi lifted one hand. Lightning coalesced along his skin like a butcher's apron, then finer. Then finer still, until the air around his palm shimmered like heat off a road. This is me with my housecoat on, he said with the faintest smile. Don't make me dress for company. Then don't make me use my voice. Naruto said, honest to the point of rudeness. I don't want to leave it here. They stood in mutual regard that wasn't truce or threat so much as two craftsmen blur checking each other's lines. Then the lattice made up its mind to choose the loudest order it had ever heard in its short machine life, and everyone's preferences became irrelevant. It reached for the vein like a mouth. Naruto took the knife out of its sheath inside him. The purpose of this lattice, he said, not to men, not to soldiers, not to Daichi, but to the room, the way you tell a child this is a chair, not a wolf. As containment, when told to eat, you will hold. When told to harm, you will cradle. When told to take, you will redirect. This is your work. The cost sheared him. His vision spotted. His tongue tasted iron and memory, twigs and camp smoke and ramen steam and rain that belonged to a younger day. The word hit the lattice like a heat event. It didn't explode. It becka me something else under the pressure. A tourniquet instead of a garrote. Shien's circle took the command the way a good jar takes a lid you finally seat correctly. The witnesses staggered a step and then steadied, as if a new gravity had introduced itself politely. The vein, which had been inches from being muzzled by a system with perfect angles and no empathy, flexed against the lattice and found it no longer a thief, merely a belt. Hinata's fingers dug into Naruto's wrist again, not to ask, to thank. She moved with him, not copying, counterpoint. Her palms set the fight into a rhythm the V.N. remembered before men had words for it. He breathed. She struck gently in a pattern only she could see, closing pathways of harm, opening ones for holding. Their work made a helix, breath and touch, heat and pressure. That wound down into the core like an idea becoming policy. Director Ashina realized he had lost cleanly enough that he decided to make it messy. He pulled a rune he had not put in. The reports. One that had cost him a secrecy he enjoyed paying. The dead man on the dead man. It would cook the inner lattice and make the vein spasm and turn the whole room into art. He told himself. This was better than letting the world be run by committees and priestesses. Karen felt the order move in the air like someone shouting into a handkerchief. No you don't, she said conversationally, and bit her own wrist. The taste of blood sharpened her focus into a knife. She spoke into the invisible ear the order was using and said, sleep, with such vicious gentleness that the order tripped. And dropped onto its face before it reached the rune. That was supposed to be expensive, Director Ashina said aloud, a little sadly. It was, Karen called back, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. For you. Above the chamber, a camp caved in on itself, not physically, organizationally. Runners with too many conflicting orders in their heads stopped running, and then, having stopped, to decide whether to keep being the kind of men they had been. Some dropped spears and took off masks with hands that shook in a way that made Tamari rethink her prepared speech and say instead, go home. Or stay and be useful. Daichi stepped forward. He was not going to let Naruto redefine a lattice and then claim the vein untouched. He set his own weight on the fact of whether. Lightning gave him more than light now. It gave him a voice of its own, not words, pressure. He set his palm out flat and pushed on a space in the room where a power was already lying down. Nothing noble, a little theft, to see if Naruto would let him. Don't, Naruto said. He did not put the knife away. He only pointed it somewhere new. Within earshot of this battle, Naruto said, and the phrase came hoarse, beautiful, bloody, alive. You will not harm. You will protect. Those who would be hurt by your strength will be shielded by it. Oath. Daichi blinked once. The back of his throat worked in that tiny W. That says your body has accepted a drink your mind didn't request. Oaths work because they touch a thing men already are. Daichi was, first, last, a keeper. He couldn't not agree in time. Lightning ran up the walls, pretty as festival. Lethal as a god. It turned at the edges of the room and laid itself over the witnesses like a blanket at just this moment. A beam snapped above the arch and wool. D have fallen across the circle and broken Xian's work. The lightning hit it first and held it until Timuri's wind shouldered it out of the way. A soldier stumbled into the mouth of a wrong corridor, and nearly took a blast meant for the conduit. Lightning took the blast and whispered it into glass. Daichi's mouth tightened. He had bound himself. Naruto had paid, but so had he. And something in him that had always admired clean arithmetic admired that cost. Tenten kicked her conduit into a better angle because you cannot trust intent to do a bolt's job. The ring sang a note Naruto had only he heard once before. The sound of his life not ending when it ought to have. Almost. She panted at no one and everyone. Now, Hinata breathed, eyes bright with a kind of joy that wasn't about winning. Naruto. Now. He could feel the core at last. Not through words. Through the palms of his hands and the old bones of the city that had decided not to be a tragedy today. He pictured what it wanted. Not free, not wild, a held freedom. An understood wildness. He exhaled along the lines Hinata had opened. The helix tightened. The vein scooted in its bed and then sat, properly, as if someone had final. Why fixed the slouch in a chair that had given everyone backaches for years? Crown, Xian said softly, but not in the way that meant coronation. In the way that meant ring. The chamber answered. Scale. S flickered across Naruto's forearms again. Not armor, not costume, announcement. Around the re-seated core, plates of luminous pattern shimmered into a floating collar, not touching, orbiting, a crown. That was also a belt that was also a promise. It did not settle on Naruto's brow. It settled into the air. Visible only if you knew it could be, audible only if you listened with the right-wrong part of your nerves. Outside, the tents sagged. The lattice hummed into its new job without loving it, a civil servant with integrity and no flair. Tamari let the wind lie down. She put the heel of her Han D against her eye and laughed in a short burst that made the shinobi near her look over and then away, smiling because she had made something love her and work for her at the same time. Director Ashen stood alone in a room where he had once been surrounded by confirmation. He did not break. He also did not learn. He put a small black book into his inner pocket and left because he had contingency plans for losing gracefully. Karen watched him go and did not chase. There were more important strings to cut. Daichi watched the crown settle where it needed to be. The storm devourer's attention HTENED like curiosity withholding judgment. Daichi couldn't assume this meant loss. He also couldn't pretend it was simple. He looked at Naruto. I can break that, he said, honest as attack. You can try, Naruto said. Too tired for swagger. I won't, Daichi said, equally honest. Not today. He glanced at the witnesses. The old woman glared at him as if he were a grandson who had forgotten to help with buckets. He saluted her without sarcasm. Your choice has witnesses, he said, approving. Good. The oath still stretched between them, humming. He lifted his palm and made a line of lightning for a door that had no stairs. And he stopped, because a thought had hit him like a fly into an eye and he wanted to choose whether to blink. Share it, Naruto asked hoarsely, somewhere between invitation and dare. Temari's head snapped toward him. Tenten's eyebrows hit her hairline. Karen clucked her tongue in a way that translated roughly to I approve of audacity as a recreational sport. Ota's hand warmed on Naruto's wrist without pressure. Daichi considered. It wasn't theater. He was deciding how much he could trust a vow he hadn't written. He came a step closer, boots echoing in AR. That had stopped wanting to be a bomb and wanted to be a story again. Terms, he said. Guardianship, Naruto said. Not a throne. Not a veto. A check. We call each other when one of us thinks the other's about to be stupid. We argue. We show up. Daichi's mouth tilted the smallest fraction. You offering oversight. I'm offering company. Naruto said, and he didn't flinch at how naked that sounded. The kind with teeth. Shion lifted an eyebrow, possibly at fate itself. Speak it clean, she advised. Naruto swallowed, coughed once, regretted it, and then, because honesty sounded better from him when it hurt, said, I will be peer to the storm's keeper at this place. I will not take alone what is not mine alone. I will ask, I will listen, I will say no when no is due. Daichi's eyes warmed in spite of himself. He touched 2 fingers to the lightning tucked at his wrist like a gentleman's handkerchief and said, I will stand equal at the place where the river wears a crown. IWILL not consolidate when consultation is necessary. I will say yes when yes is hard. The oath clicked, not like a trap, like a door on a hinge that had been waiting for oil. The pressure in Naruto's chest eased a hair, enough for him to admit to himself that he had been afraid of being alone even when a room full of friends had been touching him. He let that admission exist and then watched it like a cloud, present, not defining. The room exhaled. The witnesses did too. One of Suna's shinobi put his hand to his heart in a gesture he probably hadn't practiced for years. The runner girl, ink on her fingers, sighed a breath that told the world this would be the part she remembered when she was old. We done? Tenten asked with precisely the amount of irreverence the scene required to keep it from getting sticky. Because I can carry exactly one very tired man and 0 lightning gods back to the tents. We're done, Tamari said briskly. For today. Tomorrow I start dismantling the White Mantle's leftover trash. I will be writing to the Allied Councils with an invoice labeled Stop Building Stupid. Karen tucked the parasol under her arm and stretched like a cat. I'm going to eat the rest of their orders off the wind like theft. Then I'm going to sleep 5 hours and refuse to apologize for it. She unpacked the linen with hands steady now that the work was done, the way hands betray relief more than faces do. I'll write the right that renews this annually, she said, half to herself, half to the room. It will ask for witnesses from the city. And 1 argument. I'll make that a requirement. Gods and democracies rot without arguments. Done, Daichi said, as if this pleased him particularly. The exit from a 1 hour is always stranger than its entrance. People drifted to the stairs because the human body knows when it needs air that isn't bound to a room where oaths have just pushed their shoulders against the ceiling. Naruto turned to follow and found Hinata still looking at the crown. It rotated slowly, nothing that would be visible if you didn't know you were allowed to see it. You did it, she said softly. We did, he corrected, not borrowing humility, paying debt. Her eyes crinkled. Yes, she said, satisfied, and then she put her hand at the back of his neck with the right pressure and the certainty of someone who had learned exactly where to press to make pain consider mercy. You're not talking for the rest of the night. Bossy, he rasped. Alive, she corrected, and kissed him once, slow, the way tired people do when their bodies finally believe the next breath won't be stolen. They came up into evening. The tents looked smaller. The white had gotten dirty in just the right places. Men with masks in their hands stood in the half-light like people in a doorway choosing. Tamari walked past them with her chin up because mercy is easier if you don't give it like a favor. Tenten slung her spear across her back and told a junior mantle, If you want a job that doesn't use your spine as a filing cabinet, I'm hiring apprentices. Karen shouldered Director Ashina's little black book out of his pocket when he wasn't expecting to be touched and handed it to Shion, who slipped it into a bag like an archivist who loves a tidy shelf and hates untidy power. Daichi stood on the threshold of the ruin and looked at the desert. The storm devourer's attention drew back to a polite perimeter, not leaving, not looming. He would test this arrangement again, as promised. He would also not pretend it wasn't a better answer than ignoring men and letting towers write down the world. Next time, he said to Naruto, we argue in the open sky. Naruto nodded, conserving words. He lifted 2 fingers in a salute so lazy only a man Daichi had learned to respect would dare it. Daichi's mouth twitched and he went up, lightning building itself into a stair that folded neat as linen after his last step. Suna's banners appeared on the horizon at midden. The Cage's strike squad arriving in good order and good humor to find the problem solved and the paperwork already started. Tamari played the elder sibling mercy card and gave them work anyway. Pull the towers, she said. The metal goes to crab pots in wave. Label it philanthropy. I need donors to be happy and furious at the same time. They broke the camp different than the people who'd built it would have. Not in mockery. In correction. Tents came down and were folded with care and sent to a village that had decided to be born where there hadn't been one in a while. Tools were reclaimed, tagged, repurposed. A small shrine appeared at the entry to the heart chamber, not to beg, to remind. Ropes and bells and one earthen cup, chipped, clean. By dawn the ruin looked like a different story had happened here than the one the White Mantle had written down. That felt correct. Stories have to be edited in public. They stayed through morning to make sure good intentions didn't slip when coffee did. Sheehan taught 2 of the ruin's women how to refresh the small ring right that kept the lattice remembering its job. She refused to perform it for them past the first time. You'll make better mistakes than I will, she said, pleased, which is how a good priestess says goodbye. Karen found 3 mantle techs trying to look busy while deciding whether they believed in their own resumes anymore. She handed one a coil of wire and said, if you don't come with us, you'll regret it. If you do, you'll regret it in company. Company is better. 2 came. The third cried, which was in its way the bravest thing he had done in a while, and then he came too. Tenton bolted a ring above the glassworks door back in Suna 2 days later and hung the black steel spear there. Not a trophy, she told an apprentice staring up with hot eyes. A promise I'll make smaller and sell you for less than you want to pay. Capitalist saint, Tamari said, deadpan. Tenton threw a washer at her and Tamari deflected it with her fan. Not because she needed to, because the geometry satisfied her. Sheehan returned to Oni no Kuni by the long road, because words get better when you walk them. She left bat. Ein 3 rights copied in a script that looked like it had seen rain and not minded. Each required witnesses not related by blood and 1 honest argument. If the argument is about witnesses, she wrote in the margin, start over. Karen stayed. She declared, without asking anyone else's calendar, that she was now the anchor scout of a team that needed anchors less than it needed someone to read the sky. She installed a clothesline across the office they didn't have yet and hung maps from it with clothespins. Don't touch my lines unless you're bringing me tea, she said, and no one did, except to bring tea. Tamari wrote 3 letters with more polite harassment than some people can survive. 1 to the Allied councils, 1 to a general who had once walked away from a moral choice and pretended it counted as strategy. And 1 to Daichi. The first 2 said, in footnoted legalese, stop building God's spears. The third said, if you try to do this without telling us, I will sand your eyebrows off. Followed by a postscript, thank you for not being unbearable at Roran. She didn't send the postscript. She left it. He'd hear it eventually. Naruto's voice healed into something rougher than before. He didn't mind. The roughness sounded like a road he wanted to walk. Sometimes he put a hand to his throat and felt the place where Cost sat and he did not hate it. He respected it the way you resp. Court an old scar that reminds you not to be a different kind of idiot. He and Hinata sat on a roof the evening after Roran and watched a festival they hadn't planned spread across Suna's middle streets. The kind where people bring food to a pile in the center and then pretend they didn't so someone else will eat it. Children ran with paper crowns that had scales sketched on them, some green, some gold. Some scribbled black because some children are right about aesthetics early. You kept being you, Hinata said, head on his shoulder, voice smiling. Even with the knife in your hand. It was heavy, he admitted. Because she liked honesty more than she liked pretty. I still want to reach for it when patience would be better. That's why you have me, she said. She didn't make it sound like rescue. She made it sound like a job description both had signed. And Tamari, and Tenton, and Karen, and Sheehan. She lifted a hand and counted on his sleeve like a list of items in a store she intended to never leave without. He did the same with the fingers of his free hand. And Daichi, he said, wry, honest, astonishingly without bitterness. She laughed softly. We'll see, she said. He said yes to sharing. That's not nothing. It's not, Naruto said. He watched a kid lose a crown and another kid chase it down and give it back, not because anyone told him to, but because you get to choose who you are when something small isn't yours. He filed that away under evidence for tomorrow. Night rolled in slow, kind to roofs and hands. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Hinata talked enough for both of them. Exactly the amount he'd earned, and in the spaces between her words he remembered that quiet was not absence. It was a kind of presence that wanted to keep you. Days later, before dawn, he walked back to Roran alone because sometimes you pay respect in person. The ruin felt different. Not safe, not tame. Agreed. He went down into the heart chamber and stood inside the ring and put his palm to the floor. Just his palm, no theatrics. The crown hummed faintly at the edge of hearing. He listened. He thought of Tezuna's laugh and the causeway that didn't take the children. He thought of the bell ropes around the harbor, of Shien's salt, of the first word in a room that wants a voice and deserves one. He thought of Daichi's face when the oath bit, and the way the lightning had moved to become a shield instead of a sword. He thought of Director Ashina's little black book on Shien's shelf, trapped, irrelevant, almost ready for history to use as a warning, not a plan. Keep, he said, but without power. Without pain. Just the word, ordinary, twice. Keep. On the way out he stopped under the arch where the first hush had once made the hair rise on his arms. The morning wind ran its hands through the broken ribs of the city and sounded like a chord being tuned. He smiled a little. He did not wear the crown of scales. No one could. It hovered where it belonged. Read the weight of it instead. A ring you feel on your bones, not your brow. It was not a throne. It was a vow you had to mean again every day. He walked back into sun with his hands in his pockets. A voice he intended to be careful with in a list of work that would never get shorter if he did it right. He liked that. They all did. Chapter 5 End.